I'd get better at it over time. Nobody's an expert at anything right away. We weren't really designers when we started, and only by sort of doing did we become designers.
I was looking at some Forbes article and it was saying being a UX designer is the second best job for work-life balance.
I had a CEO that I worked for at a startup, and his feedback was one of two things. I love it. It's awesome. And I hate it. It sucks.
How's that company doing?
But they're tanked. They tanked.
Okay.
Yeah.
If I'm a young 18-year-old and I want to enter UX design, what would you tell that 18-year-old? Like, let's say your son.
Learn what the AI tools can do today. Keep a real close eye on what's coming out on a daily basis. One of those tools might be a really useful tool for you to use. And the more you know about all the different tools that are out there and all the different things that they're focused on trying to solve, the better you're going to be. So,
Now, before we move on, what's wrong with the Tesla, man? Well, today discuss with me the field of design and specifically the career of a UX designer. I have with me Dave Hoffer. Dave has been working in the field for a very, very long time and he's seen it evolve over the past 3 decades. And he's worked at some of the largest institutions. So I'm very, very excited to discuss the career of a UX designer and just the field of design in general. Thank you for coming on to the podcast. How are you doing, Dave?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me today.
Awesome, awesome. So, as usual, I like to just start really broad. What is a UX designer? What is the U? What is the X? What is the design? Take me through that.
User experience designer, UX, user experience, sort of the acronym for it. It was coined by a gentleman named Don Norman. It is a term that I've come to adopt in my own career because it is a broad look at design, or as broad a look at design, in my perspective, as you can have, which gives me sort of the optionality to be able to design for multiple different kinds of things, specifically digital design, right? Designing for websites, mobile apps, client applications, mediated experiences, service design, a lot of these different kinds of things. But user experience design, UX, that's the what that means.
Oh, okay. I mean, there was so much there that I was like, in my head, a designer just does everything on a computer. And, nowadays we just live in this digital world. So it's like tough to even, I mean, when I go out and see all these designs in the real world, I know they're designed by somebody. But like when I thought of the field and when I was preparing those questions, my brain was entirely just digital, digital, digital. And so it's interesting because it's got such broad applicability, right? So that's cool. How many years of experience do you have as a UX designer?
Well, as you said in the intro, about 3 decades. I've been doing this for quite a long time. I moved to the Bay Area in California, San Francisco to start. Right after graduating from college, my degree is in industrial design, and my first love was graphic design. Two other things we can talk about if you'd like. But when I moved to California, the web was just starting to happen in 1994, and I thought, well, this is a really interesting what I say is marriage between industrial and graphic design. This notion of web design or screen design. And as you just described, thinking about it from a digital perspective, a lot of my career has been about designing for screen-based interfaces. You know, how does a person manage their way through a flow, right, from screen to screen and from task to task, in order to get a thing done. So one that I think everyone will understand is sort of the e-commerce flow, starting from I want to pick a product, I want to put it into a basket or a cart of some kind. Maybe I'm shopping around, and at a certain point, I decide I'm going to check out, and then you go through the process of checking out. You know, Amazon makes it really easy. They came up with one click back in the very early 2000s, so you just sort of buy it and you're good to go. But that is a flow. That is a set of interactions moving from point A to point B, as a very, very narrow example of the kinds of work that we do.
So when you say flow, I'm thinking of a wireframe. Is that accurate? Like, are you saying the step by step what things ought to look like as the end user navigates a particular website or however, I mean, whatever platform we're navigating the solution on, right? I Is that accurate?
Yeah, so there are steps in the process in order to get from, here's the problem that we think we want to solve. We want to sell widgets on our website. Okay, well, let's talk about first who your audience is. Who are you trying to sell these widgets to? We want to understand who they are. We want to engage in a level of user research, right? We want to go talk to folks that might fit this description of the kinds of people that would be buying your widgets. Maybe you've been selling your widgets offline for a while. So we want to talk to folks who've been buying things offline, these widgets. So we always start with user research. And then as the steps in the process progress, it's understanding those users' needs or those buyers' needs, aligning those with the business goals, like the selling of the widgets themselves. It's understanding how best to do so in an environment. And then the steps would include something in the early phase of the process, solutioning around um, uh, what the screens might be. And wireframes are a typical step in the process. I create a kind of a blueprint. I think of wireframes as blueprints. So I create a kind of a blueprint. And it's before how it looks. It's really just about how it might work because design is both how it looks and how it works, and
Mm.
both of which are very important. Um, so the idea is you move in increasing levels of what I call fidelity, or what a lot of us call fidelity. So from low fidelity, it could be a napkin sketch or a whiteboard sketch, just a scrawl to say I think it should be this or this, to something more formal like a wireframe or a blueprint, very black and white version of the thing you're trying to develop, along the path towards something of higher fidelity, something that looks like the intended representation in the end, uh, prototyping in order to get it to begin to work like, but maybe not work fully like the final thing, and then ultimately working through the development in whatever target technology it is. So, HTML or Ruby on Rails or whatever, and any one of the different technologies that exist in order to essentially develop a tool.
Uh,
So that is the process.
I had a very different understanding of design, to be bluntly honest with you. I
What was
did.
your definition?
So I genuinely thought um, all the pretty things that we interact with, and so I didn't take into consideration that. And I thought maybe that's what a UI designer is. The interface part would be something to do with how it works, but you're like, I mean, you work in the field, so I mean, because I mean, I've always been into side ideas, and so I've created wireframes and they're not good or anything. I'm not saying like I'm like a talented designer by any means, but I've had to flesh out the concept of many ideas. And so I got Adobe XD and I started just going through like screen by screen. So I didn't realize that a UX designer does that at a high level.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes the screens that we're looking at, the fully functioning software that we interact with on a regular basis, is the result of a process of design. Um, Oftentimes in a person's portfolio, if they are a designer, you'll see very polished representations of the final resulting interface, whatever that interface is. And a good portfolio shows the sort of the steps in the process as well. How did you get here? What were the problems that you faced in solving this problem? How did you arrive at the solution that you're showing me? What were some of the other issues that you had? Walk me through the steps that it took to get to this process. That's what I'm looking for. But for just the average individual, um, if you are a person and stepping out of screen based stuff for just a moment, if you're an individual and you call, I don't know, your healthcare provider, okay, and you end up in a phone tree, and that phone tree is taking you down a number of different paths, and it's very confusing, and where do I go, what do I do? That phone tree was designed And someone sort of took the time to really think about what were the steps in that phone tree. This is the same with websites or web applications. What are the steps that it takes to get a person through a given task, as a sort of a unit of thing that they've got to accomplish. In the widget example, which widget are you going to want? How
Mhm.
do I present that in a meaningful way? What is also the content that surrounds that widget, or the picture of the widget itself, or how many pictures are there? Can I rotate it around and see it? What is the description of that widget? What's some of the metadata around it? So what are how big is it? How much does it cost? So a lot of data goes into this as well. So you're trying to think about, if you're a user experience designer, you're trying to think about as many of these constraints and aspects of what you're trying to design as possible in order to create the best design. But you mentioned UI, user interface. A lot of folks say UI UX. I don't happen to believe in that. There's a book. The author is Jesse James Garrett, and he describes a model of user experience. Um, and in that model, there are layers, right? And those layers are the things that make up the interfaces, things that make up the design as a whole. Um, if you talk about UI, right, user interface, some folks think of the user interface as the what is called the presentation layer, the surface, right? What users see, and often that contains a great deal of visual representation in order to highlight certain aspects of design and ensure that people know where the clickable elements are and what to do, and that it aligns with the brand. And then moving down that diagram from the very very surface, uh, through some of the more back end parts and pieces, are things like how does it work, right? What are the wireframes around it? Where is the data coming from? And the book is called The Elements of User Experience, and it's this relatively famous among designers diagram that describes exactly what we're talking about today.
I mean, that's awesome. It's interesting because my very limited understanding of the profession made me think that this would just be a very creative endeavor. And I'm sure it is, but it clearly also requires a very linear thought process, right? Step by step, how do you flesh out an entire user experience, right? I
That's right.
guess that works. So now that we know what a user experience does, this topic I feel like is very important. The next question is about how do you actually become a UX designer? I understand for UX design, it's kind of there's multiple different routes and it's not as prescriptive as like a profession that requires some sort of license. Um, so take me through like I know you entered the field like 28, 30 years ago. So it's a little different, but now you're involved in hiring and now you're involved in seeing new people actually come in. So take me through what are the steps that you need to become a UX designer and what you kind of see in the market.
It's a big broad question, and it depends, right? When myself and my my cohort, I consider them sort of my cohort. Some of the sort of the folks who started in design, going back, um, many of us weren't necessarily designers to start. Some of the folks that are just on off the top of my list, a gentleman with a journalism degree, a woman with a philosophy degree. So we weren't really designers when we started, and only by sort of doing did we become designers. And today it's very different. So you can go to and pay for a 4-year college degree and go learn design.
Ooh,
And there are today design programs where when I was a kid coming out of college, the design programs that were offered were in things like industrial design, graphic design. There were some very very preliminary inklings into things like web design, right? A couple of sort of classes you might take or electives, but today you can get a full on degree in it. So that's one path, is getting a degree in it. So you say, I'm 17. and I want to go to college, I think I want to go and go to CMU, right? Carnegie Mellon University, and go get a degree in design. That's a path.
So is that the name of the degree? Like Bachelor's of
You
Design?
uh, 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 I'm not sure what the actual degree name is, but we
Mhm.
can easily take a look and
Yeah.
like in Google that. Uh, but easily Googled, right? Interaction design, Carnegie Mellon, or any of the schools, right? There are X number of schools. I just it's off the top of my head, as I mentioned, that I happen to have a friend who's a professor over there, right? So any number of schools have interaction design degree offerings. And it doesn't have to be, a Carnegie Mellon or an MIT or one of these. It could be their, state schools, right? Local schools that have this. That's one path. It's just one. Other paths include simply doing it, right? At the very base, there are X number of videos and tutorials and walkthroughs to help you to learn online for free how to do this kind of work. And then it takes a certain fortitude and patience to engage at that level. But the idea would be um, you could begin to start to watch these videos. You could begin to start to read these articles. You could begin to start to buy the books, however you learn best. And for a relatively small amount of money, you could start to do it. It is a path, right? People have done that. A middle ground is a thing like a boot camp. Okay, these shorter programs that provide the core elements of the kinds of work, the core elements of the process that I described earlier, that we would go through in order to solve a design problem. And so, for anywhere from, I don't know, 6,000 to $16,000 for a 8, 10, 12, 3 month program, 12 month, 12-week program, whatever, you can go and get a kind of a certificate in design, and be able to use it. I've hired a couple of people out of these kinds of programs, and they were great. They were great at the time. So that is a path in. All three of those paths are distinct possibilities. A full-on college degree, learn essentially for free, right, on your own, or go and try this boot camp, or any combination of those things too, right? That's the other thing.
So it seems like there's 3 options. One is do a degree in design, and are these degrees 2 years, 4 years? Are you aware?
I believe 2 and 4 year programs. I
Oh,
don't I
okay.
don't think that it's limited necessarily. I think that the programs are sophisticated enough that they offer some variety.
Okay. And then option 1 is get a degree, option 2 boot camp, option 3 self-learn.
Yeah,
And so now that you've hired people probably from all 3 categories, do you think that a any of those routes create a better product for the future? And I'll tell you where my brain's going, right? In a lot of fields, there's not much progress if you don't have a degree, for instance. So managerial positions won't be available for you. You might just be stuck at the lower level for a while. You'd have to hop around significantly more from one workplace to another workplace in order to find success. So do you find that a better product comes out of university per se, or boot camps, or being a self-sufficient learner, kind of creates these attributes that you find people succeed more, or is it just like all over the place?
I think it depends. I think it depends on the places that you go, right, to work, and where you essentially end up. Um, I'm a firm believer in this notion of lifelong learning, right? I personally take the approach that I can learn from any number of things on an ongoing basis, and I've always been someone who I read, right, videos, talk to people, learn by doing, right. If a project presents something I haven't done before, I'm perfectly open to colleagues teaching me a given skill, or a given approach, or a path, or a framework that I hadn't seen before. When I first started, I worked for a number of different organizations. I ended up at a startup that got bought by Amazon, and I spent another year at Amazon. Subsequent to that, I went to a division in McGraw Hill for about 3 years and was, making web applications and other work. And when I decided to move back to San Francisco after that, I got a job at an organization called Frog Design. It's a global design firm, and the way that I talk about Frog to to people is that I feel as if it was a kind of a graduate school for me. And while I had many, if not most of the sort of the design skills, I had a ton to learn from my colleagues at Frog Design. So to your point or to your question, it very much depends on the individual. An individual with the right idea about and the right sort of level of open mindedness about their career can learn quite a bit and go as far as necessary given their abilities and their sort of skills at the task, and those skills are recognized. The talent is recognized. So again, you can go and get a 4 year degree. It doesn't make you a better designer than someone who decides to learn on their own.
Mm.
And I've seen both, right? And I've advanced both. And sometimes it takes certain hopping around, as you just described as well, to advance, and that's okay too.
So, what do you see in the market? Like, if I'm a young 18-year-old and I want to enter UX design, what would you tell that 18-year-old? Like, let's say your son.
If they were 18 and they were my son, I'd say, let me send you to school, right? Let me send you to a college. If you're 18 and you want to just start doing it, I would say, take the free route. Spend no money and watch videos X, Y, and Z. Read articles, A, B, and C, and maybe go pick up a couple of books in the library, right? That are these are the books that I would read in order to do this. And then it's a little bit of effort on their part, or quite a lot of effort, I would say, right? So um, with anything new that you haven't done before, like if I'm not a roofer, right? I wouldn't even know the first thing about putting. Oh, hell, he's a better example. He's a really good example. My wife suggested that we maybe widen our driveway, and I was like, okay, I think I can handle that. It wasn't that much, but it wasn't that much like of a change. It wasn't. I wasn't be pouring cement. I was gonna be laying some brick. So I watched a couple of videos. Okay, I had some material. Okay, I borrowed some tools, and ultimately I did an okay job. I did an okay job. I didn't do a great job, I don't think. I see all of the mistakes in the effort that I produced. Okay. I see the flaws and, oh, I should have done this right. I should have done this other thing. And I say, I probably should have hired a professional, but I was able to do it. But if I was to get into the career path of driveway installation, um, I'd get better at it over time, right? Nobody's an expert at anything right away. So this notion of the 18-year-old, the hypothetical you posed, it just means, hey, look, be prepared to learn, and be prepared to make a lot of mistakes. Mistakes are part of the bargain, right? It's part of the game. Even I, at my advanced stage of my career, make mistakes, and that's okay. It's about learning from those mistakes. It's about accepting those mistakes. It's about moving on, right?
Mm.
And um, um, taking the steps to absorb and reflect on how you're doing, right? And then just working past those. But you make more mistakes in the beginning, and you make less mistakes as time goes on.
Mhm. So, you mentioned that you would send your child to school. What would be the reasoning behind that? Why would you not tell them to just learn on their own and save themselves the money?
Um, we my wife and I have a perspective on school. Some of that perspective is actually that we can send our kids, and we're, this is an open possibility for us. Our kids are still, they're only 14 and 12. They're not ready for college yet. But we've talked about sending our kids and doing a couple years of community college. Credits transfer. They get a better sense of what they're after. It's cheaper. Okay. We think we want to send them to school because we think that um, they need the time to learn. They need time to sort of socialize and like that. And we think it's a good experience having both gone to colleges ourselves. Okay, not open to everybody, and that's okay, right? And I recognize that. So the idea of taking the free path, as I just described, um, it depends, right? So If you are a self motivated individual, right, and you learn best by reading or watching videos, great. If you need help, this is the other thing is that there are a lot of folks out there who are willing to help. Who are willing to provide a half an hour of time. Hey, I'm a young designer and I've got this portfolio. Could you take a look and let me know how I'm doing? And oftentimes the answer for me is yes, I'd be happy to help you. So it very much depends on your situation. If you simply aren't financially solvent, right, you can't go and just pay for 4 years of college, then gosh, maybe don't. So for that 18-year-old, I'd say, again, here are the 10 videos, the 3 books, the 5 articles to start. Okay, and come back to me in a month when you've absorbed that material. Um, there's plenty of design work out there as well, which is to say, that young person can go and find work to do. It might not be the best work, and they might make the mistakes and not do very well or get paid very well for it, but they're going to learn. All right, and eventually they're going to be able to ask for more and more money, feel more and more confident about their abilities, etc.
Fair enough. So you're that 18-year-old that wants to do it the self-sufficient route. And so what are the technical tools that you would tell that kid to go into and just kind of, I guess, delve into?
There's a misconception. I think you touched on a little bit earlier in the conversation. There's a misconception that design is art, and it's not. Okay. Um, but that's not to say that they don't share a common ancestry. All right. To, for lack of a better way to sort of describe it. So, having an aesthetic is a helpful aspect of design. Okay. Um, but that's not to say that again you're not making art, right? The difference between the two is that art is typically an expression of an individual, and the constraints are few and far between, right? It's really just the person's imagination is really the only constraint. Okay, and that expression is again unconstrained. Um, however, in design, because design is typically a tool, it's a job, right? Design is a job. There's a gentleman named Mike Montero who wrote a book, Design is a Job, and it is. Um, you're working for an organization, typically one that is a for-profit organization, and there are constraints. And the constraints are, in my widget example from earlier in the conversation, you have to sell these widgets. So, whatever you do, it's got to sell widgets. And if you make a change, ideally, you're making a change to sell more widgets, right? You're not making a change because you think it's a better idea, or if you think it's a better idea, you got to, convince me. So those constraints are, and those requirements are part of being a designer. So um, it's just important that you understand the big difference there. That your audience understands the big difference there. You're going out. You're doing design. It's a role of constraints, right? There are rules around it. So understanding the basics is a helpful part of the process, right? Having an aesthetic is a useful aspect of it, even if you're not going to be designing, as I described, the presentation layer or the UI. Okay. Um, Problem solving is primarily what I think of as user experience design. So, how do you get from one place to another? So, the advice I'd give would be look at any application on your phone. Pick an app on your phone. Okay. Start to walk through each of the screens. Start to take note of how the user, you, moves from screen to screen within a given task. Start to identify the tasks, right? Understand that, onboarding is considered a kind of a task and a flow, as I described earlier. Make note of the problems that you've got. Make note of the delight that it was. Make note of how the screen moves and the animation and transition between screens. That is a helpful use of the tool to provide feedback to you as a user. So you know where you're from, where you came from, and you know where you're going to in the course of a flow. How is the application tracking? So start with just a critical eye towards understanding the screens that you're looking at. If you're going to go and do screen-based design, you know, what does it mean to you?
Mm.
And that's always a good start.
So that's a that's definitely a good way to figure out, like, start developing an eye for UX design, right? Like, what kind of tools would you tell them to go into? Like, for instance, like, I remember when I started designing websites back in the day, I used Adobe, like, this was back in the day, I was using GeoCities. I don't know if you remember.
Yes.
That's where it all started.
Yeah.
And I mean, GoDaddy, none of that stuff existed. And so I had to use my own FTP and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But so I used to use Adobe Photoshop to get some of the design. I wasn't that good with Illustrator, but over time I started figuring that out. And
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I started using Adobe XD. So what are some of the tools that you would tell somebody that's just starting, hey, look into this, start playing around, and then, that's kind of where I'm going with this.
Yeah. 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 So, and it's a great question. You might laugh a little bit, or your audience might sort of laugh, but pen and paper is a perfectly good tool set.
Mm.
Goes back thousands of years. Like these are like useful tools, right? Just like start with a piece of paper and anyone can draw a box and anyone can draw a button.
Those tools
And
are
that's
going to be
typically,
gone soon, Dave.
you know, well, if you're Apple and you're crushing a bunch of our other tools, then we're going to have to use the iPad, right?
Yeah.
Um, so that's a good start, right? A pencil and paper is a perfectly good way to start. Okay, I'm not averse to suggesting to someone who maybe hadn't done any sort of design or art or anything before is to draw. Take a drawing class. It's a useful way to begin to observe things and look. So pen and paper, maybe doing a little drawing, and these are learnable skills if you've not really engaged with them before. But getting into the actual tool sets, as you just described, there were tools that I used when I first started. You mentioned Photoshop, 100%. Adobe Illustrator, yep, I've done designs, wireframes in Illustrator. Um, Tedious but doable. Okay. Um,
You should check out
there,
XD.
well, so but I was going to get to the more modern tool set.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
so for a good chunk of time, good 5 or 6 years, there was a tool called Sketch, still exists. Um, it is comparable to XD, and then the tool that is somewhat supplanted both in my mind is Figma, which is a learnable tool, right? But that is a tool of designers. What I also strongly suggest though is that it's not just about understanding the tools; it's about understanding the people. So in the process that I described earlier in the conversation about going out and doing user research, it's asking questions of people and learning to get comfortable with talking with folks about their interactions, about their experience. It's when I said a moment ago, hey, sit down and just on your phone and open up an app and just start playing with it. That's a path. But then go ask other people about their experience with that same application or different applications. So user experience design is always starts with user research, understanding what users' needs, unmet needs are, right? And just talking to them. Right. Later, you can do things like surveys and get a lot more fancy with the user research, but just a conversation is usually a very good place to start. And then for the tools themselves, when you start to actually put whatever digital pencil to screen, um, tools like XD work just fine, right? Even if you only have access to Adobe Illustrator, that actually still works. You can still do things with that.
That's hard, man.
Um, I mean, the one of the things I've been saying over the last couple of years is that the tools have become less expensive.
Mhm.
So a copy of Figma is actually a bit cheaper than the Creative Suite from Adobe. Sketch, same thing. Um, so these tools have become a little bit more less expensive, and therefore have sort of opened up and democratized design to a greater degree. But XD is a fine tool. Tools that are designed specifically to develop screen-based interfaces like XD and Sketch and Figma all work really well. Yes, people should eventually sort of dig into those tools, but I would also suggest that Tools like the ability to present that material in something as as awful as it may sound, but things like PowerPoint or even Canva, right? There's a an online tool called Canva nowadays that will do a very similar thing. But your ability to present your ideas and communicate why a particular design is better or worse might start in something like a presentation, and only at a certain point switching over to the tool itself to represent the prototype or the full on screens and be able to walk through those elements.
Seems like I need to get Figma because I'm working on a project and I've been using XD and the whole world is just doing everything on Figma. And it seems, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know, I've never used Figma. It's very translatable into the actual web app front end. I'm I think because
Yeah, yeah.
that's
The
what all
the
the so
Yeah.
online there's this no code building platform called Bubble, and essentially it's for people that don't know how to code. Although that is somewhat you need to have a very high level of logic in order to actually navigate that app. But it seems like Figma is the front end favorite for all the Bubble developers. And so I think I'm going to take a look into it regardless because it seems like it might help me as well. So going back to the question, like going back a little bit now. So we have the university route, we have the boot camp route. They both seem to make fine designers. And then we have the self sufficient route as well. Now that you're in the market, you're involved in hiring, what do you look for in a UX designer?
That's a great question. Uh, Often a designer's initial response to almost everything is it depends. It's
Sound
just
like a lawyer.
it's I know, right? Because there are constraints, right? Just as there are in the law. So uh, the constraints are you'd have to contextualize. I'm not going to ask you to do this, but contextualizing the question in a way that gives me parameters around which I'm going to be looking. So if I'm the a startup founder and I've got a technical lead and a let's say a business lead, the three of us have started this startup. The first people that I'm looking for are typically what I describe as generalist user experience designers. I'd want to hire one or two likely to start. Um, I might hire one that has a little bit more visual design capabilities, and the other that has more quote unquote interaction design capabilities. But I'd want both to be able to engage in a level of user research. And these generalist roles are ones that I'm looking for in that environment. If I'm at a large organization and there are a broad swath of needs, I'm looking for people who are content designers, okay, writers. I'm looking for people who are very specifically user researchers. I'm looking for people who are, visual designers, UI designers. I might be looking for one of the more modern terms is product designer, someone who has another set of skills. It's just a more modern term for what we do. But the sort of the answer to the question you asked depends on where I am and what I'm looking for. But I like to hire generalists if I'm building a brand new team to start. But it just depends. If I've got people on the team who are already user experience designers, I might be hiring a visual designer, I might be hiring a user researcher, people who begin to more focus and specialize in some of those tools in order to fit into the team and work collaboratively across the organization.
So it seems like when you say there's generalists, like how many different categories of design are there? I mean, I know you're going to give me a broad answer, but give me some of the big guns. When I get into the design field, who are some sought out UX design fields?
So we've touched on most of them as they relate to digital work, right? Websites or software development, mobile apps, things like this, right? We've touched on them. User experience designer is a term that I still like to use. Lately, some folks have begun to poke and prod at the notion of user center design, focusing just on the user, and sort of thinking a little bit more broadly past just one individual or individuals. But let's leave that for a minute and come back to it if you'd like. So, user experience designer, UI designer is another term. I think of the user interface and interaction design, essentially two different titles or names for the same activity, which is you're designing the interface, you're designing the interactions. Some people think about UI design as more the presentation layer, and they think of UI design as it relates to a visual designer, someone who's a lot more focused on sort of the visual aspects of enriching an interface um, in that way. But there are people who can do a number of these tasks sort of synonymously, like they work back and forth. Sometimes designers can code, but it's not something that I'm necessarily looking for. Um, Designers, in my opinion, as things move forward with um, things like AI coming on, but just generally, right? If you're going to be a designer in an organization, you should be willing to understand how that organization works. If it's a nonprofit, if it's a for-profit, how does that business make money?
Mhm.
And what are the aspects of that business that would help you to understand the problems that you're solving for? Because to a certain degree, you're the sharp end of the spear, right? You're you know going to be helping to make the screens that people see in order to sell the widgets. In the very earliest example we talked about, what are the widgets? How are the widgets made? How is the supply chain work for that organization?
Mhm.
What are the business's goals and aspirations? Understanding those business tools and aspects. But I think that covers the question.
Let
There are
me
folks
let
who
me hone
say,
in a
sorry,
little. Let me
yeah,
hone
please,
in a
please
little. So I'll do this by way of example. Like,
go
in
ahead.
law we have litigation work, and then we have mergers and acquisitions, and there's so many different areas of law. Amongst designers, which are some of the more sought out areas that people will find success in? Like, essentially, what I want is I want a young person to be watching this, and they have no idea where to start. Like, these fields are so broad, right? And so they pick up on a few skills and they want to penetrate the field. What should they be looking at? What fields and what, like, very honed in areas should they be considering to start off?
To start off, again, I strongly would suggest a generalist
Okay.
approach. Um, if you're an 18-year-old designer and you spend a year picking up some of the skills, um, finding your way into an organization that either has a lot of designers, um, let's say Facebook, Meta, right? That's one you might try. It might be challenging to get a role there, but an internship maybe. But getting into an organization like that, or an organization like a design consultancy, like a Frog Design or an IDEO, or an organization I'm familiar with, an organization called Design Map. Right, there are design led consulting efforts that would help you to be able to look across domains, solve different problems, and give you a better sense as a young designer of the kinds of problems you might want to solve later. I know people who have been at design for a long time who focus on retail, who focus on healthcare, who focus on financial or fintech. Okay, because that has become their sort of specialty. And you can try to specialize early, but I recommend generalizing early and only getting down to a more focused approach later. So, if you go to law school, I imagine they try to teach you a broad swath of different aspects of the law, right? Give you a foundational representation of the law. You go out and you pass the bar, your ability to practice law in your state. There's licensure, right? That's just how that works. It's not so for designers, although there are folks, and I don't disagree with them. Is maybe we should have a licensure for design, right? Because it can be you can get into malpractice if you're really messing it up. But anyway, generalize first, specialize later. There's plenty of opportunity to specialize down the road after you've seen the different kinds of things you want to design for, or that you can design for, or that you're better at,
Mhm.
right? Because the possibility is that you're simply better at a particular aspect of the design than others, and that includes the kind of design. So it might be that you start off as a general user experience designer, and only later narrow down and focus specifically on user research.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? I want to make sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's my understanding of the profession was so bad. So I mean, I was more on the aesthetic route. So when now that you kind of explained that there's so many different elements to this, I can see why it doesn't make sense to just go in, especially if you're young and starting, and just be like, "This is all I want to do." Because at the end of the day, there's probably communication skills required in some, there's less in some, there's probably like major teamwork required when you're dealing with software engineers and web developers and business people and finance people. And so I'm guessing that is awesome advice because you just kind of want to go into a project or a few projects and kind of find where you fit in and maximize before you decide on specializing in any particular area. Some professions do it really well. Like for instance, I learned in nursing, they actually get to go in field by field by field by field during their rotations, and they then get to decide, yeah, I like this, I don't like this. And I believe in residency is like that as well with doctors. I wish lawyers did that because there's like 100 areas of law, and like for instance, like I've practiced like 3. So if somebody asks me about law, it's like, sure, I can tell you about technology transactions, a little bit of commercial litigation, and I can tell you a little bit about personal injury. And, it's like, had we gotten this exposure on a practical level, things would have been different. So every field does it in a certain way. I don't know what the right answer is there, but it would be cool to, I guess, back to UX design, just be a generalist, go work and find out where you fit in. At least you can do that in that field, right? Because it makes sense now that we're talking why particular designers just want to stay in their field, because I mean, the user research and your understanding of what the market wants grows and expands, and you kind of become an expert in that particular area. And you know that in the healthcare field, individuals interact as such with this versus that. And so, I mean, okay, it's starting to sink in. I understand now. Now that we know a little bit about the profession, how to enter it, what to expect, I like to do this with all professions. I want to know, what are the characteristics that you find in a successful UX designers? Because I feel like not every personality suits a particular profession. So I like to set out what type of characteristics suit a profession. And then after this, I will ask you who should stay away from this profession.
Absolutely. Um, you actually just touched on a couple of aspects, and we had talked about it briefly before. But communication, right? Your ability to communicate the solutions to the design that you've come up with in clear, concise language, right? Really help to make you a more successful designer, right? So your ability to step back and say, here's this design I came up with based on the constraints of the project and the requirements that we're after as an organization, and we've gone out and we've talked with users, and we've sat and we came up with 3 other designs that we don't think were as successful, and maybe we tested some of these. You've heard of like usability testing or A/B testing. Like maybe we've tested a couple of these and they didn't test as well as these. So the reason we're coming down on these designs is for those reasons. let's all take a look at the design. Okay, communication, presentation. Did
Nope,
you?
communication
Okay,
skills, 1.
okay. The second is collaboration.
Yeah.
My friend Gretchen, Gretchen has wrote a book around collaboration. I've been on very few efforts in my career where I was working by myself, like almost none. Almost every single project or with every company, I'm always working on a team. So your ability to communicate and work with that team are really, really important aspects. So this notion of collaboration, uh, there are typically developers that you're working with. There might be product or project managers that you're working with, other designers that you're working with, and then all of you are working to deliver things to like let's say a higher level of management, and ultimately to the C-suite, right, or to the people in charge, whatever the hierarchy is in whatever organization you're in. Okay, so you need to be able to collaborate and be open-minded to other opinions, be accepting of challenges to a solution you might have come up with. So your ability to defend it is important, but your open-mindedness to a potentially better solution that you didn't think of, right? Because interaction design isn't one thing. User experience design isn't one thing. There are multiple potential solutions, right? Some might be more successful than others. Some might align more closely with the brand expression. Some might align more closely with sort of status quo and what's out there. Some might test better than others. But if something is maybe a little bit newer, less seen, maybe it didn't test as well, it was like, placed second in the testing, could be a really good solution. And you have to just sort of play with it and see and be, in some cases, willing to be brave, and to deliver that. That there's a yet another podcast that a friend of mine runs. It's called Brave UX, right? And it's about a level of courage to stand up for your convictions. So the notion of communication, okay, collaboration, and a certain amount of courage, right? Having the sort of the wherewithal to take the feedback, right, as it comes, because it comes. So if you're 18, I know a lot of 18-year-olds who have maybe a thinner skin. Be prepared to get involved in the idea of critique, and critique that's not necessarily posed in a way that is meant to, you know, ease your feelings. It's critique that can be pretty challenging and pretty hard to digest.
Mhm.
Um,
I feel like that's a general one in any field
yes,
because I've worked in so many places and I feel like a good versus a poor manager, a lot of it has to do with how they convey the feedback, right? And so
that's right.
I remember I worked at Capital One and oh my goodness, working there incredible experience because they work so hard on hiring good people that have the ability to convey what Capital One wants and what the standards are and in an incredibly professional, very mindful thought process with respect to feedback. And so they've kind of addressed the whole thick skin part. You don't need very thick skin, I guess you can say, at Capital One because they work in such a professional manner. They have different ways of making sure you work hard and you constantly improve and things of that nature. So it's interesting, like, but that the ability to take feedback is something I think you need in any field that you go into because you're pretty incompetent when you start, right? And every 2 years, you think you know everything, and then, you get slapped with a bigger problem, you're like, "Ah," right? So, it's like first 5 to 7 years, like, if you're not getting feedback, I don't know what you're doing.
Well, you get feedback, right? You just described Capital One as a more mature sounding organization in terms of the level and kind of feedback that you are provided. But be prepared for the worst. And I'll give a middle example. Okay, middle example is I had a CEO that I worked for at a startup, and his feedback was one of two things. Okay, I love it. It's awesome, and I hate it. It sucks. literally the only two pieces of feedback you'd get. And so I'd present the, one, and I love it. It's awesome. What do you like about it? What is it about this design that makes it such that you love it? Like what? I don't know. I just love it. Okay. Or, I hate it. It sucks. Why don't you like this design? What is it about this that, you don't like?
Burns you
I'd like to
inside.
be right. I'd like to be able to show you more of the stuff that you're going to like. Can you articulate to me, you know, anything past either one of those responses, which are, it really, literally, that's the only two things the guy would say. Um,
How's that company doing?
they're tanked. They tanked.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a startup, and a lot of startups just go under. Yeah, so they tanked, and whatever. But I've worked for bosses who provided a different level of feedback. It's almost as challenging or more challenging, where you present a design, and rather than even listen to you, begin to nebulously draw on a whiteboard using obfuscated language to describe highfalutin concepts that are so far above what you're trying to present that it becomes extremely challenging to merge the two. And this is yet another boss that I worked for at another startup that also tanked, where her ideas about what she was trying to convey and what she was trying to achieve were always at a much higher level than our ability to deliver at the lower level and the tactical level.
Mm,
So we were unable to communicate between each other. Like she wasn't communicating to us, make these changes, do this thing. This will get us more towards what I'm trying to talk about. And we were unable to communicate to her. Here we've delivered what we think you're after here. What are your thoughts? And it would just be we'd say, what do you think of this? Oh, let me just draw, and then there'd just be some like very nebulous scrawls on a whiteboard, and you're like, that's not really an answer. So nice person, right? But not a really good provider of feedback, in order a constructive feedback,
mm,
right? Actionable feedback that would give us the ability to move towards her ideas.
mm. So I think we went on off tangent and that was fun. But in terms of characteristics, so we have a successful UX designer ought to have good communication skills, the ability to collaborate, and the courage to advocate their solution and accept feedback. What else? Anything else you would say encompasses a regular UX designer?
Yes, sure, right. Patience, okay, both with the process of coming up with a design and the ability to communicate it right across, right, and maybe that's part of communication. But patience is a really good quality to have. The ability to think in a sort of a longer term fashion,
Mm,
and know that whatever design you deliver today will change, right? Especially digital. Digital is a colleague of mine at Frog Design used to say, nothing is final. And he was right. You deliver a design, you deliver for the delivery for the product. It launches, okay, and yet the next quarter you're working on additional features or functions, or updates or bug fixes, or a myriad of other things that need to be done, um, such that the very next quarter it looks a little different, or it behaves a little bit differently because you've tested it and you needed to add a new thing, or whatever. One of the things I find really fascinating is cars, for the most part, since their relative inception, have functioned in the same way, right? I could get into any given car and be able to basically drive it around and do what I was doing. When we bought a Tesla, I'm subsequently not as happy about the decision. But what's interesting about the Tesla is there are software updates on a regular basis. When we've seen that there's a software update to the interface and the large screen in the center of our car, I make sure to sit and examine it and understand what has changed, because if controls have changed, if functions have changed, it might affect my ability to drive the car.
mm,
And that's a dangerous thing. It's not insurmountable, but it's a potentially dangerous thing.
mm.
So we want to sort of be sure that if there's a button that I go to reach for to, do my wipers, for instance, and they've changed the functionality, I can address that. I can address it in the driveway before I'm actually in the road trying to mess with it.
Fair
So,
enough.
patience, long-term thinking. Oh, I think lifelong learning. We touched on this earlier, but this notion of lifelong learning, things change. Okay, tools change, attitudes change. The titles, right? We've discussed have sort of changed over time. The technology certainly changes. We haven't really dug into AI yet, but AI is beginning to have a very strong potential effect on the user experience design industry. Um, we haven't talked about the notion of design systems yet, um, but your ability to be a lifelong learner and to be open to the number of changes that exist over time is also a really important aspect.
Okay. So communication abilities, collaboration, courage, patience, foresight, and lifelong learning will basically be a good kit of characteristics to succeed as a UX designer. Now, before we move on, what's wrong with the Tesla, man? I mean, the way it's marketed, it seems like it's like a marvel. And it's funny because I was looking at cars and I was looking at reliability scores, and supposedly it's not very reliable. Is that accurate?
Okay, let's talk about this briefly, um, and let's separate the two things. And that by the two things I mean Elon Musk um, and the Tesla itself. Okay, low opinion of Elon Musk. I have zero. I think he has zero credibility at this point. I don't understand his rebranding of Twitter. And there's just a whole series of things. Plus, allowing Nazis on the platform. You could leave that out or not in the podcast, but suffice to say, the Tesla itself. Um, Earlier models of Tesla were really well designed and really well put together, right? I got a buddy driving around the S, and it is the fit and finish of the physical product of the Tesla itself is pretty good. Okay, I signed up for the Model 3 years back. Okay, so if you recall, or if your audience recalls, there was a certain point at which they were going to introduce a lower cost Tesla, the Model 3, into the market, and you could, for like $1,000, put your name in a list and eventually become the owner of a Tesla. Okay, at a much lower price point. It worked. It worked really well. It actually was an interesting proposition for selling cars, and a lot of people got in line and gave over some money to put behind that effort. So there was a big waiting list of people, and then the execution kicked in. Okay, so I think what happened with the Model 3, and I'll get into it specifically in a minute, but I think what happened in Model 3 is this notion of rushing to get it out the door to fulfill the waiting list of people that were waiting for the car. And so fit and finish started, I think, go out the window. Okay. My Model 3 is not as well put together as the S was. Okay. That's one thing. In addition, because of the effort to get the Model 3s out, okay, and because, cars are cars, I had been in an accident, right? It had been broken into. So getting parts to repair your car was a very, very long process that they were saving the parts for the cars that they had to deliver. Okay. So, repair, which is a huge part of any product delivery, especially cars, given their, propensity for breaking and maintenance, there's that. So that's yet another thing about my particular car. Okay. Um, I won't get into the Cybertruck. I think they just recalled them all. There's the guy who recently broke his finger because he was dumb enough to not believe it when the stick that he stuck in his trunk that broke the stick that closed on the stick, he stuck his finger and it broke his finger. That seems to be a bit of a dangerous aspect of the Cybertruck's functionality. Okay. Um, in addition to my friends who are car people who are like, oh my gosh, the Cybertruck is so poorly made and so, poorly conceived as a truck. Um, okay, so all of that aside, the change that I was talking about with the sort of the scheduled updates, where while the Teslas are advanced against potential EV competitors, things like the supercharging stations was excellent, right? They're great. I stopped being worried about taking a long trip with my Tesla because there were any number of charging stations, and the map tools inside my car would map those stations when I needed to get a charge. And then those chargers were near a restaurant or whatever. I just stop and half an hour I'm charged up and I can grab something to eat and go to the bathroom and everything else, right? No problem. And yet he just fired the supercharging team. So now it's like getting back to putting those two things together, right? So there's a lot of things about the way in which he's executed um, later stages of Tesla and having come into the organization and sort of usurped control, where I think they were off to a really good start and on a really good path. And subsequently, there have been some challenges of late. And so we'll see how they do, right? It's the story of Tesla's not over yet.
Hmm. I thought this would have been a design level critique.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're talking about design, and we are, we can begin to examine any particular design and have a really long conversation about it. Depends, right? Depending on sort of what you think of it, but it's part of it's part of design, right? Is
Mhm.
being able to sort of look at an experience, driving a car, operating a car, maintaining a car, like that. That's an experience, and it gets back to basically the topic of our conversation, which is user experience. What is my experience driving a Tesla? What are other people's experience of interacting with a Tesla? For a good long time, it's very quiet, so you don't quite hear it as well as you hear like a combustion engine car.
Mhm.
Things like this. But these are experiences, right? These are understandings that we have to just address. What is the experience of taking a self driving car, and what is that? What autonomous driving? What is that? And we're not there yet. So things like this. But that's all of these are part of an experience of car driving as it relates to Tesla specifically.
Cool. I was interested because a lot of people love it, and I just keep seeing more and more. I tried to buy one, but this is so expensive. I was like, no way. If I wanted any of the good features, it was like, especially autonomous driving. I believe the second you start ticking on the features, it somehow goes to 70 grand. And I'm like, come on, man.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's an unreasonable. Dave Ramsey would be very, very mad at me if I ended up purchasing a Tesla. But
Understood. I mean, the Model 3 is getting back to it. Like we thought we were going to get it at a price point much lower than we ended up paying.
Oh,
Right.
okay, okay.
The pressure of them to put the things together to get it out the door increased the price point. So
Yeah,
we paid
yeah.
more than we thought we were going to pay originally. The other thing is what you just described. Like if I paid an extra $5,000, I can get the self driving feature that doesn't work very well yet.
Yet. Yeah.
So right, because I my buddy has it in his S, and we've tried it, and it's a little weird. It's a little jerky. It's not quite there yet,
Well, I
and I don't
mean, I
try to
thought,
trust it.
like, from a personal perspective, I think it's kind of like, a lot of people have opinions on Elon, and it's tough being Elon because Elon has taken on the undertaking of such controversial things, right? So, I mean, what he's doing is I think it's on a scale that we've never seen before. Like, not many people have delved into space and, you know, been like an automotive Goliath and control one of the most powerful communication social platforms. So, I mean, it's kind of like there's gonna come good and bad with that. And I don't think like regular citizens can really comprehend what's going through his head because I mean the man's on a different level, to do some of the things that he's doing is just he's crazy.
Well, let me ask: are you a fan?
I have mixed feelings because I'll give you an example. I think he's absolute like, I just don't understand as a human how he accomplishes what he accomplishes, and you kinda have to marvel at that because at the end of the day, anyone that's gone through the process of trying to stand something up should know that the lift required to do some of the things that he's done, it's just, like, out of worldly. So I feel bad for him from the mental perspective because he must be borderline psycho because it's just not humanly possible to be sane and do the things that he's done. But on the other side, he's propelled technology. I guess it's the same side. On the pro side, he's propelled technology to such a high level that, I mean, think about it, like electronic cars weren't really a thing. People were talking about it, the hybrids were there, and now everyone has like an EV. And they're just trying to play catch up, right? And so even if he hasn't created a perfect product, he kind of was a trendsetter there. And so that is also another place where he's really excelled. Now, in terms of execution, there's and again, I'm just like a normal human, like commenting on this, like, but I think it's kind of dangerous, some of the things that he's done. For instance, like giving the self-driving feature in test or beta mode is, to me, beyond reckless, right? When I heard that he just, I believe it's in San Francisco, somewhere in California, where he just enabled it. I mean, that's kind of dangerous, right? Because I mean, and that's the whole thought process. If you like start like line by line thinking about what he's how he his approach is, the means don't really matter, right? It's more a matter of just like by any means necessary. And so to that effect, I'm not really a fan, but I feel like I've met some people that operate at a high level. And by high, I mean have found a lot of success in life. And for them, the means kind of get blurry and they don't really care that much. So there's pros and cons. And I mean, but honestly, like I'm kind of over the whole hating thing because at the end of the day, it's like any two people, I can find something good in them, find something bad in them. And so that's kind of how I see Elon. And I think he's done more good than bad. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
It's a fair take, and I'll say that um, I had been sort of on his side through SpaceX and through Tesla. The idea of, from a systemic perspective, the idea of Tesla providing both, here's the car you drive around in, okay? Here's the solar roof you have to generate the electricity to charge your car, okay? I'm going to put that all into Tesla in addition to a battery that I'll stick in your wall, the power wall, right? So that level of systemic thinking, I think, is the right way to go, right? I am very much in favor of this. And any organization that sort of can accomplish that is good. SpaceX clearly pushed space access to a much higher level, right? When I first saw a rocket land after, the it disengaged from his thing and just like landed on its own, like, wow, that's pretty cool. Okay. So he had, quote unquote, great success with that. I think he had the right people, right? Actual rocket scientist. He's a smart guy. Um, and I wouldn't describe him necessarily as a psychopath, but there is some level of neurodivergence going on, which, I
And
understand and allow for. And it is just like, so I agree with you. I don't know how he does it all. I think, you know, he's a very
I don't think
strange
he's a psychopath.
individual. No,
I
no,
I
yeah,
feel bad that his mind must be going through like a gazillion tasks, right? Like, I
it,
mean, if you think about how busy your day is, he has a family and he has he doesn't operate like a company or 2. He operates Goliaths.
yeah, yeah,
Like, these are the big boys of the world, right? And so for him to do that, I mean, I feel like it's crazy, like, why would someone want to take on that level of stress? And so, I mean, because I don't personally know him, it's hard for me to say I dislike him because from my perspective, he's clearly I don't know what he's doing this for, to be bluntly honest. Like he's worth like $90 billion. He's found success in every facet of life. So you have to ask yourself, does he have a power trip? Is he going through something? I don't know. Like I can't
neither do I.
navigate his brain. But
Neither
at
do
the
I.
end of the
Neither do I.
day, he's done so much positive. I have to sit there and kind of, hats off to you, man, because I just don't know any human that's, at least in my memory, that's been able to propel technology to where it is and that fast and by himself. Don't get me wrong, he's surrounded by the right people, but putting that infrastructure together, to me, that's like, holy crap, man. Kudos. Good for you. So,
Yeah.
like I said, mixed feelings. Overall, I'd say more positive than negative, but that's with everyone. I have best friends who I fight and disagree with all the time. So, until I meet Elon, if I ever meet Elon to discuss the career of engineering and how he created this, these Goliaths, I don't think it's fair for me to have any strong opinions on him. Like, because everyone that's met him says, not the people that that work with him, all the people that meet him outside of work say that he's a positive guy. So, I mean, if I ever talk to him, I'll let you know.
Fair enough. I mean, look, I've met Jeff Bezos.
Hmm.
Um, he's a lovely guy, right? He's taken quite a lot of heat for a lot of different things and practices for the Amazon organization now. But when I met him in the very early 2000s, 1999, when he bought the company that I was at, the startup that I was at called Alexa Internet, he's a lovely guy. It's a really nice guy, genuine, heartfelt, relatively transparent, good sense of humor, right? Um, Business practices of Amazon these days, I can't speak to. So I think generally what happens with folks like this is you get to be a bit of a rich person, right? Billionaires operate at a
Bit
very
of a
different level.
rich.
Yeah, they're so rich that they just start functioning within their own bubble, and bubbleization. I don't. That's not a word, but I'm just going to use it in this conversation. But like bubbleization, we've seen has caused some problems for us. Um, when we were extremely bubbled in COVID, when we were literally not hanging out with our friends as much, right? It affected our relationships,
Mhm.
and we had to find ways around the physical interaction, right? We met up with people in someone's driveway and we're all spaced far enough apart that we could have a set of drinks with masks and everything else, like COVID. But this bubbleization occurs with folks who are super rich, and they just start to function in a very different way, and hear things that are very different and behave in very different ways based on their quote unquote monetary success. So I don't know. I think it's up to history to judge. I'm not really that person. I've got opinions based on what he said and done, right? And with Twitter, right, or what X, formerly Twitter, that I just don't agree with. So I think he might be one of those people that's simply a very unique individual. Prince, okay, was an unbelievable artist, like an unquestionably talented musician and artist, right? You could go on and on. I've got friends who just are hugely faithful. He was also sort of a weird guy at a certain point, right after he'd made all his money, everything else. He'd be like, you know, like, I want a giraffe delivered to the house. Like, why can't I have that? Like, because that's crazy pants. But in maybe Prince's mind, it wasn't. And I don't know. That's an apocryphal example. There was some I heard a story, I think, but that's the kind of thing. I think you reach a level of success, fame, wealth that things just operate differently for you. And so, okay, I just got to allow that because it's like it's a thing.
Yeah. Cool. Well, let's get back to UX design.
Sure, sure,
But I wonder if that's gonna go viral. People
maybe.
care more about Elon Musk than their career. But anyways, let's see. So we were talking about the characteristics needed to succeed as a UX designer. What are the characteristics or type of folks that should not actually enter this profession? Like who would struggle?
I think you'd struggle if any of the characteristics that we discussed were characteristics that you didn't have.
Any.
Maybe not any, but
So let's go through this
you're
then. Like the
sure, sure.
ability to communicate. If you lack that, you're gonna struggle.
Um, I think if you lack the ability to communicate, it's more challenging for you
Okay.
to present your designs, to convince others that your design is a viable option. Um, there are some who I've met who are less communicative or who are more challengingly communicative, and sometimes that works for people, and sometimes it doesn't.
Mhm.
So it is an aspect that it is useful to be able to communicate. If you don't like to talk to people, I had a girlfriend way back who just wanted to work on her wireframes, just wanted to like, sit in front of a screen and make screens. Like, you can find a role in an organization, a sufficiently large organization where that's all you do. And as long as your managers recognize that and they're going to go make the screens and then I'll go do the presenting. And if you're satisfied with that level, then that's fine.
Okay.
Um,
So number 2 was collaboration. If you can't collaborate, like, can't you be that sole person just doing wireframes?
there have been individuals, and I'm going to go a little bit beyond UX. There have been individuals who've been able to produce, full on applications in a way that, they basically operated individually. Not many, but some. Okay. And so um, a recent example is the guy who invented Wordle. Right? Maybe he's not a UX designer, but he invented Wordle. Right? It became hugely popular, and then he sold to the New York Times. Great, you know, and he did it, on his own, essentially, right? Maybe he had tons of help. Maybe he asked a lot of questions, and he's got a lot of friends, and they helped him with the design or whatever, right? But that's and it's not the best example because it's not a UX example. But collaboration is a really critical part of most design efforts that I've ever been involved with because you're not doing it all on your own. You're doing the design. Maybe you're working with a user researcher and a product manager and a team of developers, and you have to be able to work with all of those folks in order to get the thing built. It's
Mm.
sufficiently large that it requires that size of a team. So collaboration is an important aspect. So if you're not a good collaborator, it can ding you.
So then the 3rd one is courage. So if you're a pushover, this is not gonna go well for you?
Well, maybe not a pushover, but although that is a thing. If you're someone afraid, um, you might get relegated to a lower level position and never sort of rise. Right?
Mm,
If you're meek and you are a good designer, you might get taken advantage of by managers who say, all right, well, I'm just going to just grab those designs and go do that. But if you don't care, or if you're too meek to speak up and say, I don't believe in this. So an aspect of the work that we do over the last number of years has included this idea of a thing called dark patterns. Okay? Interactions that are designed to encourage behaviors that are not necessarily positive for folks. Um, the notion of what I'll call, quote unquote, engagement, although a lot of people call it that, but engagement in social networks where they make it really easy for you to just like, flick through screens and scroll and stay on that app and, to quote unquote, enjoy yourself, right? So um, it sort of causes you to sort of waste time. And if you're a kid, you might get real focused on a series of time spent, right? It's just doing that. Other things like, I ran into a website. I was talking with some folks about coming in doing some work, and their website had a flow to sell their widgets. And in that flow, it said free this, free this, free shipping, free shipping. It said free shipping until the very end, and it basically hid the fact that if you shipped from a location closer, it would actually add a cost on, but it
mm.
didn't tell you. It's a dark pattern. So your courage to stand up and say, hey, I don't believe in this. You're actually deceiving people with this notion of free, 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 and then suddenly it costs an extra chunk.
Fair enough.
So I think you have to have the courage.
And
Um,
then if you lack patience and foresight,
Foresight. I mean, I think foresight's a challenging word. I don't think I use the word foresight
you
when we
didn't, that
talk,
was me.
and that's
Yeah.
okay though, because I think foresight is not a bad way to think about it in terms of the technology changing, sort of being open to the technology changing. You may not have to know what those technologies are, but you've got to sort of keep up with what those changes might be and or keep an eye on it, right? So that is a level of foresight. Um, but the notion of foresight as it relates to the design, like what could go wrong with the design, right? What And we talked just a moment ago about dark patterns. Like, what dark pattern could emerge,
Mm,
right? What behaviors might become apparent if we put a feature like this out, or if I'm working in a company that it is doing something where an emergent aspect of your interactions is actually negative. So, sort of thinking a little bit more broadly and long term about what those ideas are. So, if you're not uncomfortable with delivering and not worrying so much about that delivery, and that, let's deal with the emergent things as they come. Okay, right? Uber's a good example there. Travis decided pretty substantially to enter markets and introduce Uber, which was a better experience, right? An objectively better experience for getting around town for the rider. Okay. So for the rider, I've got my phone, I pull it up, I ask for an Uber. I've already entered
right.
my information, right? The ride shows up. It's my car. I can tell which one it is. I get in. Hi, great. Put on some music now. Whatever. Take me to a place. I get out and then I just walk away. It's a great experience. It's a better experience than taxis. And I'd said in the past, uh, we didn't know that taxis were broken until Uber fixed them. So on the one side, good technology, the right technology, a better way to use your phone and everything else for the rider. Okay. The way he engaged in entering the markets, destroying essentially taxis and taxi medallion holders' wealth, because that was their wealth. I don't know that he necessarily had to disrupt in that way to the degree that he did. I don't think that his early thinking around taking care of the drivers was substantial enough, right? Tipping didn't become a thing until years later with Uber. Um, Having those riders get paid. When the driver saturation became such that you started to not be able to make money, I don't know that he seemed to have cared very much about that as much. He simply wanted Uber in every city and all over the planet. His investors suggested maybe don't go into China, and he did anyway, right? Which is one of the bigger reasons why he eventually got forced out. But you know, um, these are things that you have to just be aware of. So these emergent sort of representations of things, right? Technology, great service, but how's it going to affect everything else? And if you're less inclined to worry about that, then okay. But be prepared to think about it later down the road, right? Fix things as you break them, right? Move fast and break things. I don't believe in that as a construct. Sure, move fast, right? Sure, break things, but let's add, and then be prepared to fix them after
Yeah.
you've broken them, because gosh, things get broken, and that's okay. Fix them, right? Don't just leave things broken. It's not a good way to be in the world.
Okay, so outside of just the opposite or lacking some of the positive characteristics that we mentioned, are there any specific characteristics that you think like you've seen in the field and you're like, hey, this person shouldn't be a UX designer?
I like for the designers that I hire to understand enough about layout that they're able to, lay a page out, make alignment changes, like just make things line up a little bit, even if they're not very focused on sort of the visual, the presentation layer. I
Attention to
just, it's
detail?
something, yeah, it's a detail thing. Uh, uh, Specifically around detail, like things like spell check, or Grammarly, right? Things that will help to sort of communicate the words that you're trying to use. Um, is a good story. I was invited down by a former professor at San Jose State University to do a critique of her industrial design class of their portfolio, or a capstone project for the semester, whatever. Great, happy to do that. So I go down, and we're reviewing student after student. They're great. Student gets up. They present what appears to be great work and a good idea in their presentation. About a 6-page presentation. Okay. And yet, each page of their presentation had at least one misspelling and several grammatical errors. And after the third one came up in the presentation, I raised my hand in the back and I said, listen, the work is great, right? I really appreciate the problem that you've attempted to solve here, and I can see that your skills are very high. But I got to ask, you spelled things wrong on a couple of these pages, and there's some grammar mistakes. it doesn't make me, if I'm a client of yours, because you're going out and doing this work for me, it doesn't inspire confidence in the work. It makes me think that if you've missed details in the words that you're saying to present the work, that the work might have detail problems as well. And he said, "Oh, well, I'm dyslexic." And I said, "Oh, okay. Did you just find out that you were dyslexic this morning?" He said, "No, I've known for years." I said, "Oh, okay. So, well, um, there are strategies to take in knowing that you have dyslexia. And in a 6-page presentation, if your roommate isn't dyslexic or your friends aren't dyslexic, and you could just have them do a quick pass at your presentation to ensure that the spelling is, because it is a collaborative effort,
Mhm.
or it can be a collaborative effort. So go back and get some help, right? Know that your dyslexia isn't something that is insurmountable, that there are ways around it, and that this stuff needs to be presented in a way that is going to inspire confidence in your eventual employer. And the spelling is important, right? So the details matter. So
It sounds like you would be a great lawyer as well, by the way. This
it's
is
about the details. It's about the loopholes,
it's
right?
it's
So
like when you're a junior and you send work to anyone senior. Like, I've worked with many teams. My current team is so prescriptive that it has a checklist, and it's like you have to do spell check. You have to make sure everything is aligned properly, all the double indentations, all the section references. It's like a 5 to 10 point checklist, and it's like don't even send this to a reviewer unless you've satisfied all of these conditions. So I think that's like any field which is client facing, any work product ought to be thoroughly examined before it goes out, right? And
that's right.
so that's good. So it seems like we have our positive characteristics. In terms of negative characteristics, the lack of positive characteristics and somebody who lacks attention to detail seems to be. So I feel it's very interesting you say that because if I were to start off thinking about the field, when you think creative people, they're typically not very linear and they're typically not very maniacal about attention to detail. So it's interesting that UX design is a very prescriptive and it has elements of creativity, obviously. I think most fields have an element of it. It's just that it seems like it requires attention to detail and it does require some of those nuanced, more maniacal levels of attention. Um, so it's kind of interesting. Like I had a very, very different thought with respect to the profession. So,
Sure, sure.
um,
To this point, there's a model that many designers adhere to, and it's a framework. It's called the double diamond. Okay, put out by the Design Management Institute years back, and a lot of people have grabbed it and begun to use it. But it basically describes two diamonds, right? Where the process looks linear, but the diamonds are meant to describe, right? If I start, I want to move in a divergent fashion, and I want to think broadly and creatively. But when it comes to beginning to execute,
mm,
right, I think in a convergent fashion.
mhm.
Okay. So I might start off broad and creative. Let's come up with as many ideas as we can. Let's brainstorm. Let's sit and think about all the different ways in which we can go with this design. But at a certain point, we got to start thinking about building it. And that takes a convergent mindset. So your ability to think in both ways is good, or your ability to collaborate in a team that has people who can think in both ways is good.
Mhm.
So if you've got folks who are more divergent in their thinking, as long as the team members that take over at a certain point go, okay, well, now how do we make this happen? How do we sort of think about those details in as meaningful a way? I like designers, as I said, who are relatively generalist, who can think in both a divergent and a convergent fashion. But you know, it's not it's not an equal weighted scenario, right? So I might hire folks who are more detail oriented, more focused on execution, or less, depending on the need.
Fair enough. So suppose I get a job with you and I start working as a UX designer. Take me through what a normal day looks like in my life. Like I want to know what to expect if I'm joining this profession.
Sure. Let's divide it into brand new project and ongoing project, so you can have a sense, because it's different for
Yeah.
each. So a brand new project, and according to the model I just described, this notion of divergent thinking, you are presented with a kind of a problem statement. Maybe it's called a creative brief in some cases. There's an RFP. I'm a company, I'm an organization, and I think I've got this problem that I want to solve. Okay. Early in a project, right? In a something where you're just really starting out, you want to examine the problem from as many different angles as is possible within the time constraints of the project. So day to day. Um, I might want to set up user research. I, very much would like to set up user research. So it's day one is let's sit down and examine what we know about this problem, and we'll sit down together in a room and sort of whiteboard it, okay, or sit down in a virtual environment and use a Canvas tool to sort of talk about what is known and what is unknown. Okay, we might arrive at a point at which we begin to say, all right, well, now let's begin to divide and conquer and begin to attack the problem. So your day two, you might get tasked as a more junior person with going and writing the aspects of the people that we're looking for so that we can then go recruit. So day two is let me just sit down and think about the people that we're going to be talking to. You might meet at the end of that second day or the next day with the team and say, I think it's these people we should go talk to. And then maybe there's some rounds of revisions. And then your day three or four is, all right, well, let me sit down and figure out how we find these people. We go and recruit them. And whether we're going to be using a recruiting firm or tools like D-Scout, um, or other sorts of ways that you're going to go find the people. I mean, back in the day, we used Craigslist. Sometimes it's just friends and family, right? Just go out and find people to go talk to and schedule those people. So, schedule as many people as you can for the following week. And then uh, those couple of days where you're waiting for the interviews, the conversations to start, you're writing out with the team the questions that you'd ask,
Mm,
just as you've written out the questions in this conversation. What do we need to ask these people in order to arrive at, you know, whatever solution we've been presented with, and or whether we think we're going to go in a different direction. Okay. Subsequent to that, you're doing the interviews. So day to day might be I've got 3 interviews scheduled today. This is, let's say, the next week. I've got 3 interviews scheduled this, today, right? So it's do I have everything I need to go out and do this interview? Do I have all the materials I need and all the recording materials? Let's say I'm going to go talk to this person um, in person. Okay. So we call this contextual inquiry. I'm going to go to their workplace or their home. Examples that I've done in the past is in developing designs for a potential set of products that were going to be introduced in Europe. We flew to Europe and we did what's called these contextual inquiries, going into people's homes and sitting and interviewing them, and then maybe doing a tour of their kitchen and talking about how we might develop the best appliances for them based on information. We go out and we do the interview. Okay. We finish the interview. We set up for the next one. We go out and do that interview. Okay. Maybe we've got to drive to another location. So there's logistics and planning. We've done all 3 interviews, and maybe at the end of the day, we're going back to our hotel room and sitting and just sort of talking about what we heard that day. Maybe we're talking with these other teams that were doing other research in other locations. So this project I'm talking about, we had teams in France and Spain and the UK. And so myself and my partner were in the UK, and then we had a couple of other teams, and we were emailing back and forth and talking about what we heard in order to potentially change what we were doing. So moving along in the process, because there's a very long answer, I don't want it to be that long, is your day to day in the early stages of a project are going to be about the divergent consideration. So after you've done all the research, your daily is you're sitting down with the team. You've all come back together, and you're starting to understand and analyze and examine and synthesize what you've heard.
mm,
Okay, and only at that point, once you've done a certain amount of synthesis, do you then begin to put pen to paper to begin to crank out little wireframes. Now, you can also present ideas in the construct of these early stage interviews hey, what if you had something like this? Because ideas come up all the time. You might engage with the client. Here's what we heard. Now let's all together sit down and not just present what we've heard, but schedule some brainstorming around solutions around what we've just heard. So you're collaborating with not only your team, but with the client. So your day is there's a workshop, okay, and the workshop is needs to be prepared for. So you've spent several days uh, uh, making materials that communicate what you've heard. Sometimes they're posters, sometimes they're role playing, sometimes they're simple presentations in like PowerPoint or whatever.
Hmm.
But the idea is we need to tell our clients what we heard, and then after we walk through this material, then we're going to work with them in a very focused brainstorming set of exercises in order to generate ideas that we'll then take into, quote unquote design.
This is like borderline project management.
It is. And often there are people whose role is project management in order to make sure that the designers are doing what the designers need to do, the user researchers doing what the user researchers need to do, the client is clear on all of the tasks and efforts that are going on with what the team is doing, so that everyone really knows sort of what their role is and how they're moving forward. Um, if you're a designer in a later, this is in this, there's a lot more steps that will get you through the actual design. But if you're the designer in a later stage effort where all of this work has been done already, your morning might start off like this, right? You've got this notion of a stand up where you meet with the team in the morning. Okay. Um, what are we going to do today? What did we do yesterday? All right. What are we going to do today? Okay. And what might we do tomorrow, and what are there any blockers to what it is you're doing. So for a designer, it's yesterday I put together a couple of different ideas for a potential solution around this interaction on this page that we've been working on for this feature. Okay, and I'll present those just after our stand up, right, an hour, right? It's an hour stand up. I'll present those in this meeting that I've got set up just after this. And we'll work with the team to identify which of these solutions is viable, feasible. We'll sort of work through the problem in that respect. You get off the stand up with the entire team, okay? Then you're sitting down and you're saying, well, these ideas that I put together yesterday, let's talk through them, okay? You present them, you talk with the team, okay? You get their feedback and the input, and then it's okay. We think we want to go with something like this. Okay, your afternoon is about addressing any of those concerns and issues, right, and making some changes. Maybe it takes you a couple days to do that. I can get these designs back out in a day or two, 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, however long it takes. Where you go and you sit back at your interface, your screen, XD, and you're working through those ideas. You're not working in a vacuum. You might be talking on a relatively regular basis with both your project manager, your team leads, the development team to ensure that any design decisions that you're making aren't going to affect the outcome of the previous decisions that you've made, or you run into other problems. And then you're dealing in the details. You're in the muck and the mire of the work, which is there is a given requirement. That requirement has X number of subtasks, and there's a series of designs that need to happen. Okay,
Mm.
and those designs are getting you through a task. Okay, they're I've got buttons that I've got to click on. I've got new components that have to be made. I've got components that have to be adjusted. Um, so a variety of different sort of specifically design related tasks. And at a certain point, at the end of usually a 2 week time frame called a sprint, okay, and the agile methodology, which is a little bit more on the engineering side, but we work within that framework. You are delivering those ideas because you've done the designs, you've handed them off to the development team, ideally with a certain amount of code that can get the things built. Okay, you're working with that team on a regular basis to go back and forth to ensure that what you've built actually, or what you've designed is actually getting built in the way that you've managed it, and then you're working towards a delivery for that sprint. It may take X number of sprints to deliver a feature set or a group of features. Okay, so concurrently, you're also working with the team to understand what the new parts and pieces are that have to be developed. Okay, so there is what's called a backlog, just a list of things that needs to be done. And the team, all right, whoever is in charge, product manager, technical lead, and lead designer are working through the feature set of the next sprint. So now we're going to develop for the next sprint. What do I do to assign for the more junior designers? Which things need to be designed for that? You're
Mm.
tracking it all as you go. You have to be able to present it and talk through it and figure out sort of what are the best solutions. So that's a really long-winded answer for
No, but
this.
honestly,
There's a ton more detail, but
this is actually exactly what I've been looking for because this kind of explains what you do. Right? So I think that was the most comprehensive answer that I have gotten with respect to what a UX designer does on a day to day basis. Because
yeah,
if someone is interested in the field, they should know that there's going to be, like, I didn't know that you spend a good amount of chunk just doing research and then actually conducting interviews. Like, when you think of all these computer related jobs, a lot of the times you're under the assumption that you're just going to be behind a screen for a vast majority, if not all, of the job. So, I mean, to know that you have to go out there, speak to people, and be driving a project and constantly taking in feedback, discussing this with various different stakeholders, like I I can see there's a lot of elements to it. It sounds similar to like a contract manager. So, like a contract manager has to do like 110 things in order to keep a project moving or a contract moving, right? And so, I mean, they're discussing stuff with different stakeholders and they constantly have to like articulate it. Their written and verbal comprehension skills need to be really high. So, it's good to know because, like I said, I was under the impression that this job was a creative endeavor behind a screen, and so, thank you very much for the robust answer with respect to what a UX designer does on a day to day basis.
there are some cases where you're in an organization, and again, because there's specialization, you as the quote unquote UX designer aren't always going out and doing the interviews. Right? You might have a user research team specifically who's focusing on, actually doing the interviews. Then you're simply communicating with them. Different definitions of user experience designer out there. Um, that's one thing. Sometimes you're simply behind the screen and doing an interview like we're doing right now, as opposed to going out into the quote unquote field to do the research. So there's all sorts of different ways to do the research in order to get information. Some organizations want you to skip the research. They think
Wow.
they know what the problem is, and they say, "We know what the problem is. We know how to do design. We know what this problem is because we're experts. Go ahead and make screens for us." I don't recommend getting involved in an organization like that, but there are organizations like that. But all else that you described is true-ish, right? You are sitting behind a screen a good chunk of the day. The time to design, which can be really challenging to communicate, right? Solving a design problem is there's a lot of noodling. There's a lot of you try things out, right? It's like um,
It's
I'm gonna put this button here. I'm gonna put it over here. I'm gonna have this flow go from this to this, and then you've got to sort of think about the the use cases, right? What is the primary use case? What are some secondary use cases, tertiary use cases, and what are called edge cases that will ensure that I've got the right ideas here, right? And it is really a very focused. I'll sit in front of my screen and come up with the right flows and the right sort of answers to the questions around what happens if a user does X. Well, we don't want a user to make a mistake. We want to prevent the mistake from being made, but if they do happen to go down a path where they make a mistake, how can we help them to correct it very easily?
mm,
How can we provide feedback that the form that you fill out has been filled out incorrectly in a way that gives them the ability to you know change the mistake that they made, etc. Right? We you try to make a form so that you don't make a mistake, but mistakes can be made, and all different kinds of cases. So
do you think the job is stressful? It sounds like it's very demanding in terms of like there's like 100 moving parts and you kind of can't seem to miss the ball because it'll slow the project cycle a lot. But hey, what's your insight? Is it a stressful profession at large? Do you feel like because and although it seems like that to me, I was looking at some Forbes article and it was saying being a UX designer is the second best job for work-life balance. And so let's just discuss stress. I'll talk to you about work-life
Well,
balance after.
okay. Stress can be stressful. Okay. There's a lot of demand for you as a designer to deliver, the solution that you've been asked to deliver. Okay. Um, and if you don't, it can shift priorities in the delivery schedule. It can slow the process down. It can delay the project, etc. Possible. Um, so yeah, there is some stress, but I imagine there's stress in almost every job. Okay. When I was a kid, before I became a designer, I waited tables. Okay, and waiting tables you don't think of as necessarily a stressful job because if you've never done it, you're sitting at a table and the waiter comes over and they get you your meal and you eat and you're having a great time. But if you've ever experienced, what you think of as a sort of a bad waiter, might not be the waiter's fault.
Mhm.
Maybe they have too many tables, right? Maybe they get behind because timing is a very important aspect of service in a restaurant. So you've gotten behind, or maybe the kitchen is behind, so the food's coming up slower, and you only experience that as a sort of a singular table. But then you have to think about the sort of the democracy of it. If that server has 5 tables in their section, you don't notice necessarily as an individual designer, or if you're on a date or out with your family, you don't notice the other tables because you're just like, where's my food? Where are my drinks? Why isn't my check here? Um, so stressful, can be stressful. So all jobs I think have an aspect of stress, and so yes, I think that design can be stressful, and it's important to understand that what it is that you're doing requires a certain amount of effort. Some aspects of design are more stressful than others. Maybe not as stressful as being a nurse. We talked about being a nurse earlier, like in an ER. I can't imagine because that can be life or death. So our work isn't life or death usually, but it's important that the work we do is done right. And so yeah, there's some stress.
I feel like whenever you fit within a project, there's stress. Because if you don't execute, you're screwing everyone at the other end of the project, right? And so, I mean, whenever you're working in a company, there are deliverables required, and the next deliverable cannot start until you finish yours. It's kind of an issue. So, well, moving on. I was going to ask you all these questions about whether this is a team structure or independent, but obviously, this is a team oriented job. Collaboration is one of the key characteristics of a UX designer. Obviously, the job does not get redundant because there's so many different things. So let me just move on. Do
Well,
you?
well, before you move on, you also asked about work life balance.
I'm getting there. I'm going to get
Oh,
there.
you are okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. What is the work arrangement for UX designers? Like, is this a field that after COVID it has predominantly gone back into the office, or is it still like remote and hybrid-ish?
It depends on what the company wants. It can be remote fully. It can be hybrid, right? It can be, the demand could be you have to be in the office.
What are you seeing in the market right now? Like,
I,
I'll tell
I, I
you, like for
see.
instance, in law firms, they're
Yeah.
all calling back. So unless you're working for a small or medium-sized law firm, it is more likely than not, and by typically more likely than not means 50 or more. No, this is like almost every single law firm that's in big law, at least, is going back to the office 3 minimum, and I believe now they're actually adjusting to 4 days a week. So,
Right.
I mean, in my opinion, that's just like back at the office. It's like pseudo hybrid.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let me say that I'm seeing that as well. There is a desire to get individuals back into the office and at their desks, at least in a hybrid fashion. Um, but I've also seen fully remote work, right? And even prior to COVID, I'd done remote efforts. Okay. The other thing that I would describe in terms of design is two different models of the work. So while I was at Frog Design, uh, global design firm, I think they're owned by Cap Gemini at this point. But when I was at Frog Design, we operated under what I think of as a studio model, what a lot of people think of as a studio model. And that model is we meet with the client, maybe we do a week with them on site at their location, or they come to us. We examine the problem, we decide what we're actually trying to solve for, and then the client goes home and we go back to our studio and we work through the problem. And then, there's checkpoints, calls maybe over the course of the weeks. And then we meet up for a midpoint and present the work that we've, arrived at. Or maybe there's a couple of checkpoints of presentation, and that could be remote or in person. And then we go back, but it's basically you function in more of a studio where you're working in the office. Okay. When I went to McKinsey, so I think I was maybe the eighth user experience designer hired at McKinsey, and eventually, built up offices, led teams, etc. There was something like when I left McKinsey in 2020, there was something like 400 designers worldwide. But anyway, they have a very different model at McKinsey. And the model is 4 days on site at the client. So one project I had, we had to be in northern Nevada 4 days a week. So that meant, okay, leaving very early on a Monday morning, arriving in Salt Lake, so flying from San Francisco, arriving in Salt Lake City. And then there was an afternoon flight that we could take, or we could simply rent a car and then drive back towards northern Nevada
But
to be at the client site. Sorry, go ahead.
sorry to interrupt, but that's
Please.
all this is all pre-COVID, right?
Oh,
Like, I'm
yep.
a little bit more interested in what you're seeing in the
Post COVID.
market today because, I mean, how people did things 10, 15 years
Yeah.
ago, like, the whole world has changed, right? Do you find that after COVID, companies are trying to go back to how it was before, or is the market still stuck in a kind of a remote world?
Uh, um, it is a variety. There are companies that are like, we can be fully remote. There are companies who are working in a hybrid fashion. Okay. There are companies that are, you
Fully
have to
back.
be back in the office. Okay. For a company like Google or Apple, who spend an enormous amount of money on these like gorgeous and lovely facilities, I think there's a desire to get folks back in the office to a certain degree.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, the economies of the sort of ecosystems that exist around these offices, especially in cities
Yeah.
where, the lunch places are closing because people aren't at the office to actually come down and have the lunch,
Mhm.
is problematic. Okay. Why spend money on the real estate if, no one's there to go do that? So there is a desire on the part of some organizations. Everyone should come back to work. Um, there's a desire on the part of workers to not have to do that. They found that they can do their work remotely. Prior to COVID, there was this notion that you couldn't really do work remotely necessarily. Okay, getting on video calls and whatever, but some companies were operating like that. But you just go into an office. There's an office. You have a desk. You go into an office. And now we know that we can actually work remotely. So in the McKinsey story I was telling is like, we there was an on-client site 4 days a week, but they were able to switch gears and subsequently save a ton of money on hotels and flights and meals. That they actually saved a certain amount of money on that, and they were able to do their work relatively effectively over the course of COVID and lockdown remotely.
Fair enough.
So we've discovered that remote can work. Okay, companies are trying to negotiate. Whether if they've got a facility, like, look, we want you to be here. But I've also heard stories, right? I haven't actually had to experience this yet. All of the work I've done in the last 4 years has been remote. Okay, but there have been stories that I've heard where you're asked to work in a hybrid fashion. You show up at the office and there's no one there, and you get on a video call with the people that you're working with. So you're just taking your video call from the office, and why, right? And so there's that as an answer. But it is a mixed bag. Some companies want you to work, at the office full time, come back to the office. Some are trying to negotiate a hybrid scenario. Um, as long as everyone knows when to be there and when not. And some are saying, we can operate remotely and maybe we'll shut down the office or whatever. So
Fair enough. Sounds like they're still figuring it out. Some fields are just all back. So,
yeah.
anywho, let's see. Money. So, for all the work that UX designers do, I know you can Google this stuff and it varies, but what should somebody that's just starting off kind of expect? And like, what have you seen in the market in terms of do you job hop in order to get more pay? Like, what would you recommend to somebody that's early in the field? What should they expect?
Um, I won't put a number on an early designer's like expected salary. There are salary guides, and you just mentioned that can be Googled. Plenty of those sorts of searches can be done to give you a sense. What I like to say is that it's a negotiation, right? As with pretty much everything, the organization says we need a designer who is at this level of expertise, and here's the range of salary that we offer. So any job description, or many job descriptions actually are starting to come with, here's the salary range, and then it's whatever you negotiate coming into the organization.
Is it common to hit at least 100K? Because that seems to be like a standard of life now. Those days of like 80K will get you all your happiness and all that. I think that's gone. I'm not with that anymore. I don't think normal Americans and Canadians can survive off of $80,000. Inflation has been unhealthy as of late. And so, among many other reasons, if some economic guy wants to rip me into shreds, but, like, how long, like, is this a field where people can see that trajectory into 100 plus K over the course of, like, a few years? Because, even in fields such as accounting, it takes time to get there. It's like 4 or 5 years, and then they finally get to 100K, and then once they become partner, I mean, they go into, like, millions. So, I mean, obviously depending on many factors, but can you tell me a little bit about the career progression and, like, what do high earners and the UX designers typically earn?
You can earn six-figure salaries. It's doable. Maybe not out the gate, but it's doable. And this information is maybe no longer accurate or sort of true necessarily. But when I was a kid, right, just starting out in design, and I got a job at a startup, I was making I think $40,000 a year. Okay, I also had some stock, right? So I was working at a startup, and part of the compensation package, because a compensation package isn't just your salary. Okay, um, that was part of the compensation package. I got stock and I got salary, and of course, things like 401k and health benefits and et cetera, et cetera, right? So young designers should expect to earn less. Okay, live with roommates, maybe continue eating ramen after college, um, things like this. Uh, Getting a job at a place like Google might be a little bit better because some of the perks can be better. So you might get a free lunch package because you go work in the facility, et cetera, which is another reason to get people back to work, right? Things like that. Later, I was able to work my way into the six figures, and of late, it's fluctuated. I think that the salaries have come down a bit from their quote unquote peak, um, you know, prior to maybe 2022, where the salaries were very, very high. But you have to start to talk about the economic implications of what's going on. So you mentioned inflation, but also interest rates. So as interest rates came up, money became um, a more difficult prospect for organizations to get their hands on. It wasn't relatively free anymore. They actually started to pay the interest rates, and therefore, I think we've seen a lot of organizations downsize as a result of this. And when I say downsize, lay off people. And laying off people where they were hired at a very high rate means they can rehire people at a lower rate. So, all that being said, it's a very lucrative field. And when you move up to a certain level, you can expect a six-figure salary,
So
right? But
six
it
six
means
figures
it means paying
broad.
your dues early. Sorry.
Six figures kind of broad. Like, what are these numbers like? What does a high earner in UX design earn?
Oh, I mean, you can make 150
Hmm.
as a a relatively like a low level senior
Hmm.
or a high level junior. Okay, you can make that much money, which is great. Depends on the organization you're working for. If you're working in like a nonprofit, you're not going to make as much money, right?
Of
That's just
course.
true. They have less money to give. If you're working in a startup, like I said, you might earn less salary and take more stock. It's about the levers of compensation, which are there's a variety. Maybe there's a bonus attached,
Hmm.
and you make numbers, you get a bonus, and then there's more incentive. So performance based. So there's a lot of factors. But you, as a let's say a senior is 150. Someone who's a director and above, 250, right? Depending, right?
Makes
If you
sense.
are a much higher level, you can earn 500 with maybe another 100,000, bonus. Stock options become very, very lucrative over time. So
That's very interesting to know because I mean, it seems like the salary progression is very normal. That's how so many careers are, but UX design is easier to get into. Like the barrier to entry is a lot less, right? Compared to doing like suppose like becoming a lawyer, like you have to do 4 years of bachelor's, 3 years of law school, then you have to write the bar exam and then that's when you enter, right? So yeah, sure we get paid a little bit more, but probably a lot more in the beginning. And but I mean, I think it caps off unless you're becoming a partner, it caps off at I believe 480, right? At 8th year, something like that. And so to know that after like 10 plus years without a degree with just technical experience and you can get up to those numbers. I mean, you have to weigh the opportunity cost of schooling at that point, right? So that's very, very interesting. Are there some, I know you mentioned the lunch at Google, but are there some special perks of being a UX designer that like you wouldn't know of unless you actually became one? Like there's some random things, right? Like nursing, you work like 3 days,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
like lawyers, we get good rates on certain things. Our insurance is lower because supposedly we're going to get into less car accidents.
I mean, I started to talk about McKinsey a moment ago. I mean, one of the quote unquote perks depends on sort of your familial situation. Is if you're flying to my first project at McKinsey. Okay, I started, and that day I was told, hey, I we need you to fly to Jakarta, okay, and work on a project there. Um, and McKinsey happens to be an organization that wants you to very much be taken care of in the to and from. And when I say to and from, the travel, okay, and the hotels that you stay in, then they make you work 20 hours a day,
Mhm.
right? Your work life balance tends to be a little bit more challenging. Um, but I flew, Cathay Pacific to Jakarta. I think I had to stop in Hong Kong. I forget exactly how that flight worked, but I was very well taken care of on the way over. And I had a lovely hotel. And then I worked 20 hours a day in Jakarta.
20?
Yeah, easy.
That's crazy.
But McKinsey, right? You're
Oh
sort of
yeah.
expected to work at a very high level.
Yeah.
And early on, I would expect to work a very long set of hours, maybe not 20. That's excessive, but early in your career, work your ass off. Work, 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 right? Learn, work, do, get the job done, prove your worth, right? And that monetary compensation usually comes later, okay? But those perks were things like they had the policy of you could take a spouse and they could stay in your hotel, so as long as they weren't paying for the flight, but the spouse flies over, can stay in your hotel room, and then y'all can take a day. Figure out a day you can just like take a day and check out Jakarta, for instance. Okay, that's a kind of a perk.
That's a cool
Um,
perk.
yeah, but that means getting a job at McKinsey, which is massively challenging. A small perk. Well, maybe not a small perk. I don't know. It depends on how much you want to sort of, or what your definition of perk is. Here's a perk. Okay. Um, when I worked at Frog Design, we did a project for Disney. We were working directly for the Imagineers. at Disney. It's the group of people who, were building out the parks basically. So the project was to deliver ideas to the Imagineering team for the experience of the park. And so we did some user research. We said, well, let's do some user research. This is great. So here's what we'll have you do. All right, we were in San Francisco. They had us fly down to LA. Okay. We stayed in the park hotel, and we, with a couple of the Imagineering people, one, maybe sometimes both, because we were working with a couple of folks, they took us around the park all day. So we had 2 full days in the park to experience and sort of think about the experience of the park. So, you know, it was work, but we were riding rides. And they didn't want to just take us directly to the front. They didn't just fast track us in each thing. They wanted us to experience what it meant to, be a park goer at a Disney in a Disney experience and stand in the lines. So we would talk with them. We'd ask questions. They asked us not to disturb the other guests. We wanted to do what are called intercepts, which were asking other people at the park what it was like to be at the park, but they didn't want us to do that. They said, look, you can ask us whatever questions you want, but we want you to experience the park. So the perk was being in that location and riding rides all day, right? Going to Disneyland was the perk. It was exciting and it was work, and we were taking a ton of pictures and asking a lot of questions and taking a ton of notes because it was user research and it was work, but it was a fun piece of work.
Mm. So I'm guessing you get
So
those projects from time to time though, right? It's not
from
just
time to
like
time,
Disney, it's like whatever you're working on, you kind of have to really get firsthand experience with respect to that project, right?
that's correct.
That's cool.
That is
That's
correct.
cool.
I use that as an example of a because you asked about perks. Like, well, it was a fun project. I think design is fun for me, so I do it. The problem solving is fun for me, so I do it. Not every project I've been on has been that fun,
Mhm.
right? Going to Disneyland is the project run like, but those projects exist, right? And then it's just a question of um, recognizing the perk, right, and
Mhm.
taking advantage. But we didn't take advantage. It wasn't like we were trying to put one over. We literally had to just go ride rides in order to understand how we might represent better ideas for the experience that we were trying to convey to our client about how could we make this ride better? What could we do to make the experience of waiting in line better? What can we do to make the experience at the park better generally? So
Mm. So now we can get talking about work life balance. You said you like, let's take McKinsey out. Let's not discuss McKinsey. When I was researching the profession, it ranked UX designer right behind corporate recruiter as the greatest job for work life balance. Is that your experience? Let's just say, let's not go all the way back because I think the work culture has changed so much. But would you say, as of the past 5 to 7 years, there's work life balance in the field? And if so, like how much do you think on average a UX designer should expect to work? And this is I know you said in the beginning you should work your ass off. Um, but I just want to know, what does like a normal UX designer work? And do they have work life balance?
in mature, yes, the answer is yes. In mature organizations, mature groups and development teams and design teams, there is absolutely a reasonable work life balance. Okay, so 8 hours a day, right? You go do your job. Because your job isn't normally very taxing. You're sitting essentially in front of your screens a lot of the time. Um, you know, Relatively straightforward. So in the last years, there are organizations that function in that way. There are ones that don't, but yes, it is a perfectly viable work life balance until there are deadlines that need to be achieved, and sometimes those deadlines mean longer hours. So as you get closer to a deadline, this thing is due, a big presentation, a big piece of design work, you might put in some more hours closer to that deadline in order to fulfill the deadline and ensure that it gets done.
But on
Um,
average, you would say it's just normal 40 hours.
yeah, I mean, I'm the type of person that doesn't just work 40 hours. I sort of can't help myself. A lot of designers tend to sort of fall in that camp. So you can work a 50 hour easily. You can work a 60-hour week. easily. You're still not in the 20-hour range like we were just talking about from McKinsey. That's crazy pants. It's exhausting. Um, and not all people at McKinsey do that, right? Um, but there are a lot of folks certainly early in your careers where you're like you want to impress, and so anyway. Um, and we're not talking about McKinsey, but there are longer hours that you put in order to essentially solve problems or work towards specific deliverables or deadlines in order to achieve that design. And of course, there's some noodling involved. And when I say noodling, I mean um, playing, experimenting, and that time commitment can be challenging to nail down. You know, so I once got asked. This is one of the dumbest questions I ever got asked. But there was a VP at an organization I was in said, "How many wireframes can Dave produce in a day?" And the answer was the ones that are needed, all of them, four. It's a ridiculous question. Um, you know, uh, it was just a ridiculous question. The person was trying to measure my output, and the output of design is challenging to measure in some cases because it requires what I call noodling, or just literally doing the design work, which can be playing with the screens and trying to figure out how to move back and forth and trying to account for edge cases and coming up with alternatives, right? So if a design is due, I like to see three as a leader of the project. I want to see three ideas. Give me three ideas so we can examine each one and see which one works the best, and or we can test those concepts with users and determine which of them work better in testing. So longer hours, closer to deadlines, that kind of thing. And it depends on the type of person you are. So you can easily put in 50, 60 hour week.
Yeah, I feel like that's a individual thing. Like I'm more concerned about, is this a field where work-life balance is even possible, right? Because I mean, if they're ranked one of the most chill jobs, that would mean that some people take their job seriously, some people don't take their job seriously, and but at least you have the option, right? There's fields where you do not have an option. If you're a doctor, good luck. Like someone's going to die in the event you're having an off day. If you're a lawyer, it's kind of similar as well. Like you're probably going to get fired. You won't last very long in the field if you're constantly concerned about working 40 hours. And same thing in many fields. So, like, I've noticed in project based fields, I've seen every single personality where you have that person that wants to move up, is willing to put in excess hours, and they do move up. By the way, those are the people that they're on everyone's radar because they're intimately involved in every single file. And then there's people that like to lay back, relax, collect a check, and I mean, to each its own, right, at the end of the day.
Sure,
And
sure.
so when I ask how many hours do they work on average, I what I hear is 40 is what's required of me. And in the event you want to actually be a leader in the field and you want to progress, you need to work more and you need to take on more ownership and you need to spend more time. That's what I heard.
Accurate, right? The other thing is, and I don't know about the methodology that the Forbes sort of arrived at, UX design being sort of number two, but it might also be about compensation. So if I work 60 hours a week, but I'm well compensated, then it's really not that big a deal.
Mhm.
Or if I'm younger and I am unattached, right? I don't have a wife and a kid or two kids. I'm not as worried about paying my mortgage, things like this. Then longer hours is really not a bad thing, right? You're just working a little bit longer.
Mhm.
But you're making friends and you're networking with the people you're working with.
Yeah.
Ostensibly, you like the people that you work with, so it's really not that bad. Um, if you like what you do, and I think it's a fun job, right? The hours tend to be less important to you, and therefore, I don't understand sort of what questions were asked in the Forbes piece in order to get to a determination of what is work life balance. But those factors probably came into play,
Mm.
right? So maybe they do work longer hours, but they're not as that it's not as big a deal. Or maybe they do work less hours and they're perfectly okay with turning in their designs, and they're good at it enough to be able to turn in the right designs and everything else. And so yeah,
Many factors.
yeah, I think so.
So I feel like we've discussed a lot. What do you think? Like, I'll just be specific. At first, I wanted to know what should UX designers at large need to know about before getting into this field. But let's just hone in. Dolly's here. AI is, really having an impact in many of the. I recently actually just saw, so my wife is a data scientist, and there's this, I forget the name of the AI solution, but you can just pop in the data and it'll analyze for you and it'll perform. It was quite extensive according to what she said. So whether we like it or not, even the tech area is somewhat getting hit with AI. So what do you see in the field, and what would you tell youngins that are joining?
We talked about lifelong learning earlier. It is, and we talked about sort of foresight. Critical that you keep an eye on AI, and not just keep an eye on, learn the different AI tools and how they will or won't be affecting your jobs.
Mm,
Years ago, I wrote an article called it "Design is Free," and we talked about the tools earlier being more expensive and becoming less expensive. Things like icons aren't necessarily the first thing you've got to worry about. There are so many icon sets, low cost or free icon sets that are available. They just don't have to worry about designing an icon. You can go get a set, or the team can go get a set for X number of dollars, however much, and then you've got all the icons you need. At Frog, we had a guy who just designed icons, and he was really good at it. But you just don't have to do that as much anymore, unless you're a company that we have to have our own icons, and it's part of our brand, and let's develop a set that are very unique to us and everything else. Okay, fonts are free, things like this. So I wrote this article called "Design is Free," and one of the things that I foresaw but didn't necessarily see in my specific or in our specific industry in digital product development was the notion that if I do screen based design, there are going to be tools that are going to come along, like there are starting to be today, where the analysis of user research output. And I'm working with a startup right now. It's an AI startup, and a woman who's developed a tool that will analyze and synthesize the video, the transcript, or the just the audio of conversations, and her AI that she's developed will basically provide a level of synthesis and analysis that makes your time to examine that as a person a lot shorter, right? It really does a really good job. Okay, so that's just one tool. You talked about Dolly or some of the other sort of image generation tools. Those are going to put some people out of business, and there will be organizations who decide that they only want to use essentially an auto generated or an AI generated thing, right? And those tools are becoming more and more substantial. Their ability to create a full on video out of a prompt is pretty interesting. Um, if you've got what is called a design system, okay, there was some work being done by Airbnb when I wrote that article I just talked about, where they were playing with this notion of pointing a camera at a whiteboard, and as you began to scratch out an interface in a whiteboard, it would examine what was going on the whiteboard and translate that into their design system and begin to make componentry that you could use. So that sort of thing is closer and closer. There was a tool at the time that I wrote the article that's called the Grid, which purported to allow you to put in whatever content you want, pictures, text, whatever you want, and then it would spit out a full-on interface, full-on screens or website for you, whatever. We're really super close to that. I'm not familiar with a particular tool that's doing that right now, but we're really close to that. So your ability to learn these tools, learn what they can do, learn how to use them and work with them is really, really critical. Okay. I'm a firm believer in a construct that I'll describe, which is that when Gary Kasparov, chess master, it was grandmaster, finally got beat by, I think it was Watson, okay, a while back. He didn't just give up. What he said was, "Well, okay, well let's see how else we can do this. Let's my mastery of chess has changed." So what he said is, he said, "Right, we're gonna take a tool like Watson and put it together with a couple of human players. And what he found was that that team was relatively unbeatable by like just a single, other Watson and just an AI. Okay, so he used it as an enabler, the tools as enabling to the work that you do. And in some cases, it's going to replace. In some cases, it's going to enable, and in some cases, it simply won't do exactly what a human can do. But the fact is that you'd be remiss if you didn't pay attention to the AI tools as they are starting to develop. They're very robust right now, and they're going to be even more robust as time goes by.
Awesome. I think that's the case in every field. I think there's just I don't think I mean, I'm not an expert in this area, but I feel like AI is going to be supplementing rather than replacing. And I think some of the more repetitive, redundant, easy work can definitely be taken away from AI, which is going to help. Um, but then as I also think about that, that's going to make our job more stressful and tiring because like I sometimes think about my work and what makes it difficult and it's the amount of cognitive resources that are required to create a good work product. And so as AI keeps taking away the simpler stuff, which, sometimes towards the end of the night, I'm like, let me do some of this and simpler tasks in order. And, I'm still billing time at that time. But at the end of the day, that's contributing towards my 2000 hours, which is kind of a prerequisite at almost every big law firm. And now that's going to be gone. So now you're telling me that all 2000 of my hours have to be heavy cognition. And I feel like that's going to take a mental toll in the totality of time, at least in the legal field. But I still don't think that AI will be able to replace us just because we provide such tailored solutions. But I mean, who knows? Like, I mean, again, like I don't understand AI. I don't know how much it's going to improve. I mean, it's only been around for like 2 years, and
Well,
maybe it's been around for longer. But like Chat
yeah,
GPT
it's
came around 2 years ago, and
right.
already you can like do so much. So I mean, 10 years from now, I don't know where these solutions are going to take us. And to say that I have any insight, I don't. But that's where my head kind of goes with this thought process. I mean, with this, how AI has kind of intervened in our lives.
Yeah, so they've been working on AI for a really long time.
Hmm.
So it's way older than 2 years, right?
Mm.
That's number one. Number two is AI, as expressed in things like ChatGPT, are really taking advantage of these things called large language models. And to say that it's AI is not totally true yet. A lot of folks are thinking about true AI or AGI, artificial general intelligence, where it's actually an intelligent thing. Um, you and I think had talked prior to this conversation about there was a lawyer who used ChatGPT to
Hmm.
attempt to do a thing, and the some of the AIs are doing what's called hallucinating, is they're making stuff up, right? Because they're like, oh, here's a precedent, and he was disbarred because of this. So
Hmm.
you be careful about the results that you get from the tools that exist today.
Hmm.
What is it going to be like in 10 years? I think it's going to be really interesting, and I'm really fascinated to see. I can look back on my career and I can see how the tools have changed the way in which we do things. So, um, far back, I'll talk about how desktop publishing scared graphic designers when it first came on the scene. And this is just before my career got started. Some of the graphic designers were like, "Oh, it's computers, and we do things all in an analog fashion, right?" If you were working at a graphic design studio, you did this thing called paste up, which is you literally like took little strips of words and hot waxed them down to paper, and then made things that you could send on to the printers. And just computers solved a lot of that, but it made things a lot easier, right? So desktop publishing became a thing. It democratized things as well. People got their hands on some desktop publishing tools and became designers, in ways that designers didn't expect. Maybe they weren't looked at as great designers, but they became designers. So things shifted. Okay. Um, A closer representation of this is a tool like Figma and design systems, right? And I've said design systems a couple of times. Design system is simply um, components of any given interface have been designed such that the design team doesn't have to design repetitive components over and over again. So a button is always, a button. The designers don't have to redesign the button at the lowest, not the lowest level, but at a low level. So buttons are, you just grab a button out of the system and start to use it. It's like a library of design tools. And Figma takes advantage of this library and allows you to, create new interfaces, new designs using the existing componentry, this design system. So Figma and your ability to understand how Figma works and have a design system means that the barrier to entry to being a user interface designer or even a user experience designer can be lower in some cases, right? If you can use the tool and you can use and understand how the design system works, you can start to put together screens that begin to look very much like an interface, even if you don't really understand some of the underlying constructs of interaction design, information architecture, right? How
Probably what I'm
you move
doing.
from screen to screen, transitions. Yeah, another set of words, right? But suffice to say, like you can put screens together and put reasonable looking interfaces, even if they don't work so well. So this democratization has sort of occurred in this modern tool, Figma, and it will only um, get both better and worse as AI gets integrated into a tool like Figma. So
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, AI is like an interesting conversation because I know that example has been given a lot. People have always been scared about their jobs dissipating as a result of, evolving technologies. But it seems like the scope is so different now. I feel and I'm pretty confident when technological solutions did come, a crap ton of jobs must have just evaporated, right? It's not like when the computer came, a lot of things didn't go, right? There were many jobs that had to translate, right? And they did have to evolve, and people did have to actually let go of their, like, look at taxis, for instance, right? Like, if you were a taxi driver back in the day, good luck. Like, they don't care about how expensive your license plate was. Technology came, they created, like you said, they fixed taxis, right? And all of a sudden, those guys that were getting compensated at a very different rate are now earning somewhere between 18 and $25 an hour. And I feel like AI is pretty powerful, not something to be underestimated. At least it seems like that because I mean, you're right. I do think it's in a phase right now where it's undergoing testing and it's kind of reckless and you shouldn't rely on it too much because I ask it for advice and I'm like, I know the answer and I don't get the right answers. Right. And I also feel currently that unless you're sophisticated enough at the craft, you just don't know what question to ask, right?
agreed.
I mean, if you're like a doctor asking legal advice, for instance, and I'm sure WebMD is kind of indicative of this, right? Somehow you're always going to die, right? But you're not really going to get to the right answer. So I think there's some kinks that have to be ironed out, but I'm definitely on alert. I need to I can't say I'm at ease because I think the growth curve, like, the transition from no computer to computer, there was a huge learning curve, right? Barely
Yep,
anybody had the ability to get a computer. It was a very
correct,
expensive resource. It took
correct.
time for everyone to acclimate. The internet never existed. There was very limited use case. Today, everyone's got a computer. Everyone's got internet. Everyone's got technology. The base level understanding of how computers function are is very, very high. So it's a little scary, if from my opinion, what can take place. Um, but I think we'll find out over the next decade, and let's
We
see what
will.
happens.
I think um, the AI integrations are starting to feel faster and faster,
Mhm.
right? So versus the desktop publishing example I gave earlier, right? I worked in 1989 When I graduated from high school, I worked for a graphic designer in New York. I was living in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and I would commute into New York, and I'd work for this guy. And he had one Macintosh computer, and the rest of his work was all done essentially by hand. All his graphic design work was done by hand. He had one designer at the time who was even willing to go sit at the computer and try to play with it, who sat and learned the tool. Okay, um, you wouldn't find that today, but it took a couple of years for him to, gather. I'm sure gather more and more computers and arm every, designer with sort of the tool to be able to do that. And he probably did just fine, sort of doing some of the analog or most of the analog for a time. Okay, but today I think that the this particular technology is moving very quickly. Um, so we'll see. We'll see how things go, and yeah, we'll see in 10 years' time. I want to see. I want to break that up. I want to, what's it going to be like in 2 years? What's going to be like 2 years after that? What's going to be like in 6 months, right? I really want to see, but I think that the timeframes are quicker, and we just have to be as aware of that as possible. And if you're an 18-year-old or a 22-year-old who's just wanting to get into design, learn what the AI tools can do today. Keep a real close eye on what's coming out on a daily basis. One of those tools might be a really useful tool for you to use. And the more you know about all the different tools that are out there and all the different things that they're focused on trying to solve, the better you're going to be. So,
Fair enough. Well, we're coming near the end, so you're probably tired. I mean, 3 hours, man. So, now that you have, like, almost 30 years of experience, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting off as a UX designer?
we talked a lot about these things earlier, but I'll say it again. I think you have to be open minded. Okay, you've got to have the courage to speak your mind, but also know your place. Right, junior designers aren't, or junior anybody, anyone starting out in a field should really listen and sort of be aware that you don't know everything and that there's a lot to learn. So listen, have the courage to, get the critiques that are going to make you a better designer. Be patient with it. If you want it, go for it. Focus on it. Work harder earlier, knowing that it'll pay off later. Um, all of those things I think are really good pieces of advice for your listeners who are, just getting started. So yeah, those are the things to be aware of.
Fair enough. So, I close off all podcast episodes by asking everyone, what is the best career advice you have ever received?
The best career advice during the internet bubble, the original internet bubble, in sort of very early in 2000, 2001. So the bubble burst in the tech industry. All of these companies immediately went out of business right away. And I was living in San Francisco in a more expensive apartment than I can afford. Okay. I had just gone through a really bad breakup with my ex at the time, really horrific. And she had left, and I'm just sort of sitting in this big, spacious, gorgeous, brand new apartment that I couldn't afford. And I was out of work for about 6 months. And I was really at the end of my rope. I was pretty sad and depressed. And I talked to my father. I said, "Well, what am I going to do?" And he said, "Well, do you think you'll never work again?" And it was literally like an eye-opening construct. Like, of course I'll work again. Of course I'll, go and do this. Um, I subsequently found a job. Right, it ended up being a really good job with, I made really good friends. Spent a chunk of time there. I learned a lot. So that was the best career advice I've ever gotten.
Awesome. I mean, that is really good career advice if you think about it. But you genuinely think you'll never be working again? That's cool. Haven't heard that before. On the other end, what is the worst career advice you have ever received?
The worst career advice. It's not advice that was given to me, but it's advice that I have learned and that I will give. It's coming from me. Okay, I firmly believe that you, in whatever field you're in this case design, you should decide uh, what it is that you want out of that career and what it is that you want out of sort of doing the work For me, it's the problem solving I find extremely rewarding. But you should examine sort of what is most important to you, and that you should not take a job expressly for the money.
So the worst career advice would be then to take a job for the money, just for the money.
Yeah, yeah. So given if you were in a position where you're a young designer and you're being offered two different jobs, so you've actually made it to the point where you're getting two different offers, and one is more lucrative. Okay, uh, don't dismiss the other one just because the money is better at the other role. Money comes, as you advance your career. So it may be that the other role will be more rewarding, will have better people to work with, you will learn more, etc. Right? That the money isn't the decision to make, as the sort of your primary focus. You work with the organization that is going to give you more money. Maybe they're going to treat you more poorly. Maybe you're not going to get to work on as good, as interesting problems. When I was here, this is advice that I did get. Advice that I got when I was in college was I was an industrial design major. So physical product design was what I was learning. I had an elective with a guy who became my mentor. He's a lovely guy who was the ceramics professor. So I really enjoyed throwing and making pottery and things. It was just fun. So I took a couple of those electives, and then I became friendly with the guy who was the professor. He said, "Look," he said, "don't or think past just being an industrial designer. If you go to work for a company like Frigidaire, you're the designer who designs the refrigerator handles, and that is truer, right? Or I'll equate it to being a designer today, a young designer today, going to work for Meta, where your focus is designing the refrigerator handles at Meta, which is a very small, inconsequential thing. Now, maybe you get paid more, but if you're working on in a smaller organization that pays you less, you might be more exposed to bigger and harder problems to solve than designing the I don't know, the login screen for the enterprise tool, and that's your only thing that you're working on. It
Mhm.
can be boring. So don't just think about the money. Think about sort of what makes you happy, or work towards that.
The money will come.
I think the money comes. Yeah, I think the money does come for sure.
Well, it was an absolute pleasure, Dave. I feel like I even know a lot about UX designer, the career. I feel like I'm an entry level UX designer myself. I just never knew because so for backgrounds, I've developed like I got myself out of university just designing websites. And so I didn't know that I was doing all of this, but I guess I was. I used to sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and draw out each and every single page step by step. And back then, we didn't have many resources. I just had an HTML book and I learned HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And so it was kind of interesting. I guess I'm a baby UX designer and it paid for my university fees. So let's go. But it was an absolute pleasure learning about the career, man. And thank you for coming on and sharing everything 30 years worth of experience. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me today. I very much hope I've answered your questions. It was a pleasure meeting you. Um, all of these things. So I mean, I wish your audience the best of luck. It can be really challenging to start off in any career. So I sort of understand that, and so really persevere and go out in the world and do good work. So thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Well, have a good one.
Okay, I'll talk to you.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode of the My Career Shop podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a much better idea of how to become a UX designer and what to expect once you actually become one. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, leave a review, and comment on what professions you want me to invite next and what other information you'd be interested in learning. See you soon.